The helicopter was cutting through the early morning sky, its blades slicing through the crisp, cool air. The sun had just begun to rise over the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the landscape below. For Jack Turner, it was another routine flight. He'd made this trip countless times, ferrying passengers from the city to a remote research facility in the mountains. The kind of job that felt like clockwork. He knew the terrain, the weather, and the people he flew with. Today, though, something felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a nagging sense in the pit of his stomach. It was the kind of feeling that made him double-check the controls, triple-check his route. As Jack adjusted the altitude, his hands steady on the controls, the calmness in the cockpit was shattered by a sudden, loud thump. The helicopter lurched, throwing Jack against his seat. The usual hum of the engine was replaced by an eerie silence, and for a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. His heart raced as he immediately checked the instruments. "What the hell?" Jack muttered under his breath. The airspeed indicator was flickering, and the compass spun wildly. He reached for the radio, but the static was deafening. The helicopter jolted again, and this time, he saw the door to the cockpit swing open. "Get down!" a voice shouted, followed by the sound of footsteps rushing into the cockpit. Jack's mind snapped into action, his years of military training kicking in. Two men, masked and armed, stood before him. Their eyes, cold and determined, locked onto him. "Hands up, pilot," the taller one barked, a gun trained on Jack's chest. Jack's hand moved instinctively to the emergency button, but before he could press it, the shorter of the two men slammed the butt of his rifle against Jack's arm, forcing him to pull back. He winced from the pain, but kept his focus sharp. The helicopter was still in the air, but without control, it was just a metal coffin. "Who the hell are you?" Jack demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The adrenaline pumping through him made his heart race, but he fought to stay calm. He couldn't let them see the panic. "We're the ones in charge now," the taller man sneered. "Do what we say, and no one gets hurt." Jack's eyes flicked between the two hijackers. They weren't just some random criminals. They had a plan, and that plan had just started unfolding, with him as the unwilling key player. "Tell me what you want," Jack said, his voice cool. He could feel the sweat trickling down his neck despite the chill of the morning air. The hijacker's smile was thin and malicious. "First, we take control. Then we'll talk business." Jack's mind raced, analyzing every possible outcome. If he didn't act fast, this would be the last flight he ever made. He flicked a switch on the dashboard, trying to send a distress signal, but the static continued. His hope faded as he realized they must have already jammed the communications. The silence in the cockpit was deafening, broken only by the whir of the helicopter's blades and the menacing presence of the hijackers. As Jack was about to take a deeper breath and formulate his next move, a strange noise filled the cockpit. It was a slight hum, barely noticeable at first, but it grew louder, almost like a whisper in the background. Jack's mind flicked to his training again. Something wasn't right. Something felt off. The hijackers didn't notice. They were too busy positioning themselves at the front of the cockpit, keeping Jack in their sights. The sound, though, was unmistakable. The hum was coming from something in the distance, something important. Suddenly, Jack's radio crackled to life. "Turner, do you read me?" It was a familiar voice, Captain Morgan, the head of operations at the helicopter company. Jack's heart leaped in his chest. "Roger that, Captain. We've got a situation up here," Jack said, trying to sound as calm as possible. He couldn't afford to show fear now. Not to the hijackers. Not to anyone. "I need immediate assistance. I've got armed hijackers in the cockpit, requesting backup." For a brief moment, Jack thought there was hope. But then the hijacker holding the rifle toward him pulled a second radio from his belt and tossed it out of the cockpit door. Jack's stomach dropped as he realized they were prepared for everything. They had thought of everything. "No one's coming for you," the hijacker said, his voice cold and final. "This bird is ours now." The seconds ticked by like hours. Jack could feel the heat of the gun barrel pressing against his ribs, the cold sweat on his palms, the tightness in his chest. But as the helicopter continued its steady course, he was suddenly aware of something strange in the air. A sensation he couldn't explain, like a low hum vibrating through his body. Just as he was about to push that feeling aside and focus on the situation at hand, he saw it. A flash of light far below, too bright to ignore. Jack, the radio crackled again, this time sounding more distorted. Elon Musk's team, the signal cut out abruptly, leaving nothing but static behind. But that brief, broken message caught Jack off guard. Elon Musk? What did he have to do with this? Before Jack could process, the hijacker in the back turned to face him with a menacing grin. Did you think you'd get out of this alive? Jack swallowed hard, trying to hold on to whatever thread of calm he had left. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. As the situation spiraled out of control, Jack had a feeling this wasn't just another hijacking. There was something bigger at play, something far more dangerous. Suddenly, his mind flashed back to that strange humming noise. The one that came from where? Jack's thoughts raced as his pulse quickened. Could it be? In the midst of the chaos, Jack realized there was only one thing that could possibly save him: the passengers and the crew. But whether it would be enough, he had no idea. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jack Turner wasn't always a helicopter pilot. Years ago, he had worn the uniform of a military officer, his boots kicking up dust on the gritty, sun-baked fields of distant war zones. It was there, in the thick of danger, that he had learned the skills that had made him a natural in the cockpit. But military service wasn't something Jack wanted to talk about. His time in the Army, full of blood, grit, and loss, was now nothing more than a chapter of his life he kept locked away. But today, that chapter had found a way to resurface. Jack's thoughts drifted back to a moment from his military days, one that had left a permanent mark on his soul. He had been stationed in the Middle East, during a routine mission when everything had gone wrong. A helicopter he was aboard had taken fire, and a series of rapid decisions had ultimately saved the crew, but not without cost. A good man had died that day, a friend who Jack had sworn to protect. That was the moment Jack swore he would never leave things to chance again. When he left the military, he knew what he needed to do next. Become a pilot, not just any pilot, but the kind who could think on his feet, who could adapt to any situation. Flying was his escape, but it was also his responsibility. Jack snapped back to the present as his hand adjusted the controls, feeling the familiar weight of the helicopter beneath him. Outside, the world looked peaceful, untouched by the storm brewing within the walls of the cockpit. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting soft shadows on the panels. There was a calmness to the view, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to relax. The world felt quiet, normal. But then, the thought hit him again, the nagging sensation in his gut that had been there since the start of this flight. Something was off. Turning his attention to the passengers in the cabin, Jack noticed them for the first time. There were 5 of them: a young couple, a middle-aged man in a suit, a nervous-looking woman with a child beside her, and an elderly man whose hands shook slightly as he gripped the armrest. He recognized none of them, but they all looked just like the usual clients. Regular people with regular lives, all seeking the same quiet comfort of a quick, private flight. Jack always found it odd how people could be so unaware of the danger that lurked in the world. Sure, a few might be nervous flyers, but most people never really thought about what it would take to survive in the worst-case scenario. To them, a helicopter was just a mode of transport, something that got them from one place to another. But for Jack, every flight carried the weight of what could go wrong. And today, something had already gone wrong. He glanced at the time. Another hour before they reached their destination. The route would take them over thick, mountainous terrain, with no easy place to land. He knew the area well, had flown it dozens of times, but the realization hit him again. These passengers had no idea what they were flying into. His gaze drifted to the man sitting in the back of the cabin, wearing a dark suit, his face tense. Jack had barely noticed him at first, but now, there was something about the man that didn't sit right. The way he held himself, the quick glances he kept giving Jack, like he knew something. It wasn't just paranoia. There was an unsettling aura around the man. The man caught Jack's eye and gave a small nod, as if acknowledging some unspoken connection. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. Was the man aware of the hijackers? Or was there something even more dangerous going on? Jack tried to shake the thought from his mind, but the unease wouldn't leave him. His military instincts told him to trust his gut, but that had led to more heartache than he cared to admit. His eyes then shifted to the control panel, his fingers twitching over the switches. The radio was still dead, no signal, no hope of outside help. The only thing Jack had left now was his training, and the faint hope that, somehow, he could outsmart the hijackers. They were professional, but he'd dealt with worse. He knew how to stay calm when everything else was falling apart. It wasn't the first time Jack had faced a life-or-death situation, but it was the first time he had faced one as a civilian. As much as he hated to admit it, flying helicopters wasn't just about technical skill. It was about understanding the people you were flying, their backgrounds, their fears. He'd flown high-powered executives, rock stars, and families, and while they all had their own baggage, it was the passengers you couldn't read that worried him the most. And this group, they didn't fit the usual mold. Something felt wrong. As his hand tightened around the stick, he reminded himself that he'd faced worse odds before. When his father had passed, he'd been left to take care of his family. When his mother's health started to decline, Jack had been the one to take her to the hospital, the one who carried the weight of their financial struggles, and the one who did everything in his power to protect his younger sister, Sarah. He glanced at his phone in the corner of the dashboard. A few missed calls from Emily, his wife. His stomach tightened. Emily had always been his rock. She was the calm to his storm, the one person who could always pull him back from the edge. He pressed the button to call her back, but the call wouldn't go through. A sense of dread gripped him. What if something had happened to her? What if this hijacking was just the beginning of a nightmare that would affect everyone he loved? The thought was interrupted by another violent jolt as the helicopter lurched to the left. The hijackers were moving again, pushing into the cockpit, their footsteps coming closer. Jack's mind raced. There was no more time to waste. He had to act now, before they took everything from him. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself, though the words felt empty. "Stay calm. You can do this." Just like the training. And with that, Jack knew one thing for certain. He was no longer just a pilot. He was the only thing standing between his passengers and certain death. And whatever it took, he wasn't going down without a fight. The tension in the cockpit was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the gun barrel still trained on his chest. The two hijackers were no longer standing just behind him, their presence like a shadow he couldn't escape. Every breath he took felt heavy, laden with the weight of the lives on the line. His own, the passengers in the back, and even these men, whom he had yet to fully understand. The tall one, the leader, was still at the front, his eyes locked on Jack's movements, waiting for him to make a mistake. The smaller one, meanwhile, was rummaging through the cabinets in the cockpit, pulling out maps and papers as if he was searching for something specific. Jack's mind raced, but he forced himself to focus, pushing away the terror that threatened to overwhelm him. He had been in tight situations before. He could do this. "Listen," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You don't want to do this. You hijacked this flight, and you're looking at a lifetime in prison. You can still turn this around." The tall hijacker didn't respond immediately. He just watched Jack, his cold, calculating eyes never leaving the pilot. Finally, he spoke. "You think we care about prison?" His voice was low, almost a growl. "You think we care about anything except getting what we came here for?" Jack's grip tightened on the controls. "What do you want?" he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. It was risky, but he needed information. He needed a crack, something he could use. The leader glanced at his partner, a brief exchange of looks before he took a step closer. Jack's heart pounded harder, but he didn't flinch. The hijacker spoke again, his words measured, deliberate. "There's someone out there who doesn't want us to fail. Someone who's invested a lot of money into this, and we're here to collect what's ours." Jack tried to mask his confusion. "What are you talking about?" But before the hijacker could respond, the smaller one slammed a map onto the cockpit table, pointing to a location on the paper with an urgency that caught Jack off guard. "Here," he exclaimed, tapping a spot on the map with his finger. "That's where we're going. You get us there, or we'll make sure you regret it." Jack stared at the location. It was on the edge of a remote mountain range, far from any populated areas. It wasn't a place where most people would willingly fly. In fact, it was the kind of place that only appeared on certain high-level corporate or government charts. Jack's stomach twisted as he realized the hijackers weren't just after money. They were after something far more significant. "Who are you working for?" Jack demanded. "Who's behind this?" The leader's lips twisted into a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll find out soon enough. But if you're smart, you'll stop asking questions." Jack took a breath, trying to steady himself. His mind raced. He knew this wasn't just a random hijacking. These men were highly organized, their movements precise. This was bigger than he'd imagined. And he had a bad feeling that the passengers on board were more than just innocent bystanders. "What are you going to do with them?" Jack asked, nodding toward the back of the helicopter. "They're just collateral," the leader said, his voice cold. "We need you to get us where we need to go. If they get in the way, we'll deal with them. Simple as that." Jack's blood ran cold. The casualness with which the hijackers spoke about killing people made his skin crawl. But there was something more troubling, something about their confidence. They weren't worried about getting caught, and they certainly weren't fazed by the possibility of death. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were part of something much larger than a simple robbery. A sudden thought hit him. "What if I don't take you there?" The leader chuckled darkly. "You're not in a position to make demands, pilot." Jack didn't respond immediately. His mind was working quickly now, weighing his options. He had two choices: comply and hope he could find a way out of this later, or fight back and risk everything. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he was out of options. But there was one thing the hijackers didn't know. He had a plan, and it didn't involve getting out of this alive. Jack had been in tight spots before, but never like this. The difference was, this time he had something they didn't. Jack's hand slid toward the emergency eject button under the dashboard. His fingers brushed against it, a momentary spark of hope flooding his chest. This was his one chance to call for help. If only he could send the signal before they stopped him. He had to take the risk. Before he could press it, the smaller hijacker turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "Don't even think about it," the man warned, pointing the rifle at Jack's head. The leader didn't flinch. He was still focused on the map, but there was a certain sense of finality to his words. "It's over, pilot. You're just a means to an end now." Jack knew there was no turning back. He had to outsmart them, somehow. Just then, something caught Jack's attention. The strange hum. It was back again, more pronounced this time. It was almost like a low vibration, something mechanical, yet it wasn't coming from the helicopter. Jack's mind raced. Where was it coming from? The hijackers didn't seem to notice, but the vibration in the cockpit was growing stronger, almost like the air itself was changing. A deep instinct kicked in. Jack's military training told him to trust his senses. And right now, his senses were telling him that something bigger was at play, something far beyond a simple hijacking. The strange hum in the cockpit grew louder, vibrating through the entire structure of the helicopter. At first, Jack thought it might have been a malfunction, a simple technical glitch that could be quickly resolved. But the longer the sound persisted, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't coming from any of the usual systems. It wasn't the engine, it wasn't the rotors. It was something deeper, like an eerie presence in the air itself. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't let the hijackers notice that he was distracted. He had to stay focused, stay in control, no matter how unsettling this feeling was. The last thing he needed was for them to think he was losing his composure. The taller hijacker, who had yet to speak more than a few words, stepped closer to Jack, eyeing him with suspicion. "What's that noise?" he asked, his voice sharp. Jack forced himself to act casual. "It's nothing. Probably just some interference. We're flying over some rough terrain, that's all." The hijacker seemed unconvinced, but didn't press further. Instead, he looked back toward the back of the helicopter, where the other passengers were nervously glancing around. Jack could hear a few whispered conversations behind him, some panic beginning to creep into the voices. The hum intensified for a moment, then suddenly stopped. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had never experienced anything like this before. The silence that followed felt oppressive, as though the world itself had held its breath. He glanced quickly at the hijackers. Both of them seemed confused, exchanging looks. "What the hell was that?" the smaller one muttered, his eyes scanning the cockpit and the space beyond. "I don't know," Jack replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But it's gone now." The leader seemed to lose interest in the noise, shifting his focus back to the map in front of him. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hum had felt deliberate, as if it was meant to send a message. It didn't feel like random interference, and the fact that it stopped so abruptly only added to the growing sense of dread. "Where are we headed?" the leader asked, his eyes narrowing as he glanced up from the map. Jack swallowed hard. He didn't want to tell them the truth, that they were flying into a remote part of the mountains where there were no emergency landing zones, no places to hide, and no way out. But he couldn't lie to them either. "We're approaching the drop-off point," Jack said carefully, "but we're still about 20 minutes away." The leader nodded, satisfied for the moment, but Jack noticed that he was still keeping a close eye on him. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, and it was clear the hijackers were growing impatient. Jack had no doubt that if he didn't find a way to take control of this situation soon, they would make their next move, and that move could be deadly. Jack's mind shifted gears. He had to figure out what was causing that strange hum. If it wasn't a malfunction, then it was something else, something intentional. But what? And why now? He glanced again at the map. It wasn't just a random location. It was a place that he recognized, one of the most secluded, uninhabited spots in the entire region. The coordinates marked a spot near a private research facility, one that was only known to a select few in the tech industry. The facility wasn't officially on any public map, and Jack had only heard whispers about it. The hum from earlier clicked into place. It wasn't just interference. It was a signal, and it wasn't coming from the helicopter. Jack's stomach sank. Could this be connected to something bigger? Maybe it wasn't just a hijacking at all. Maybe these men weren't just after money. Maybe they were after something much more dangerous. The smaller hijacker turned his gaze back to Jack. "Hey, what's going on with that thing?" He pointed to the control panel. "Something's wrong with the altitude. Why are we losing height?" Jack snapped his attention to the dashboard. His heart skipped a beat as he noticed it, too. The altitude was dropping, slowly but steadily. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, his fingers quickly scanning the readouts. The helicopter's systems were functioning properly, yet the altitude was still decreasing. He hit the button to switch to autopilot, but the system didn't respond. His pulse quickened. This wasn't good. "Is there a problem?" the leader asked, his tone turning sharp. Jack didn't look up. "I'm checking it now," he said, his voice tense. "The altitude control's not responding." The small hijacker took a step forward, his face growing more intense. "Fix it now," he demanded, gripping the barrel of his rifle tighter. Jack nodded but didn't move. His mind was racing as he glanced out the window. The ground below was growing nearer, the jagged, rocky terrain now visible through the haze. They were losing altitude much too quickly, and Jack couldn't afford to waste time. The aircraft was heading straight for the mountainside. He quickly ran through his options. There was only one thing left to try: the emergency manual override. It was a last-ditch effort, but it was his best shot. Just as Jack's hand hovered over the override button, the hum returned, louder, more insistent this time. It was coming from the direction of the mountain range, as if the very land itself was sending a warning. Jack hesitated. Was it possible that someone, or something, was controlling their descent? Was this the real reason the hijackers were after this flight? He didn't have time to figure it out. His fingers slammed onto the override button, but the helicopter didn't respond. Panic surged inside him as he realized that whatever had caused the hum, whatever had taken control of their descent, had just hijacked their helicopter for a second time. The helicopter groaned, its engine straining against the unseen force pulling them downward. Jack's fingers were a blur over the controls, desperately trying to regain control of the descent. But no matter what he did, the altitude continued to plummet. It was as if the very air around them had thickened, resisting every attempt to pull them back up. He glanced at the hijackers. The smaller one was growing agitated, his rifle twitching in his hands as he stared nervously at the controls. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice rising with panic. "This isn't part of the plan." The leader, usually calm and composed, was now visibly rattled. His eyes darted between the control panel and the window, where the jagged mountains loomed ever closer. He took a step toward Jack, his hand tightening around the grip of his weapon. "You said you could handle this. Fix it now." Jack gritted his teeth, fighting back the rising panic. He had one shot left. He could manually adjust the collective pitch, but it required precise control. A slight mistake could send them crashing into the mountainside. Another violent shake rattled the cockpit, and Jack's hand shot to the manual lever, pushing it forward with as much force as he dared. The helicopter jerked, groaning in protest as it fought against his commands. The descent slowed, but it was still too fast. The ground was coming up way too quickly. "Come on," Jack muttered to himself, sweat beading on his forehead. He couldn't afford to panic, but every second felt like an eternity. If they didn't level out soon, they were going to crash, and there would be no survivors. The smaller hijacker was practically beside himself now, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "We're going to crash. We're all going to die." Jack fought to ignore him. If he allowed himself to react, to let the fear take over, they were all finished. The leader of the hijackers was standing behind him now, silent, watching, his expression unreadable. Jack had to believe the man had no idea what was really going on. It was clear the hijackers hadn't anticipated a mechanical failure, or whatever this was. They hadn't planned for this kind of crisis. Jack's thoughts briefly flickered to the passengers. He couldn't let them know how bad it was. He couldn't let them panic. He needed their help to stay calm, to be prepared for what was coming. If they crashed, they needed to be ready to survive. The helicopter dropped another few feet. His hands were shaking, but Jack kept his focus, adjusting the collective pitch again, trying to buy himself more time. Just a little longer. Then, the hum returned. It was louder now, vibrating through the very structure of the helicopter. It wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't random interference. The noise was deliberate, a signal, and it wasn't coming from the helicopter. "Do you hear that?" the leader asked, his voice unusually strained. Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. The hum was coming from below. No, not just from below. It was coming from everywhere. The mountains themselves seemed to be emitting the sound, vibrating in synchronicity with the chopper's descent. The sound became almost unbearable, an oppressive force pressing in from all sides. Jack could feel it deep in his bones, an overwhelming sensation that made his head swim. It wasn't just noise, it was a signal, a command. The helicopter dropped lower, closer to the mountainside. The ground was a blur beneath them now, nothing but jagged rocks and sharp cliffs. The manual override button was useless. The autopilot was still malfunctioning. Jack's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Suddenly, the leader of the hijackers lunged forward, grabbing Jack by the shoulder. "What are you waiting for? We're going down." Jack's mind snapped into focus. This wasn't just a hijacking, it was a trap, and someone was controlling it. Someone, or something, was preventing him from stabilizing the helicopter. The hum was the signal, and the descent was part of the plan. "Get away from me," Jack snapped, pushing the hijacker's hand off his shoulder. "This isn't your fault. You need to sit down and shut up if you want to survive." The leader's eyes flashed with fury, but he hesitated, clearly thrown off by Jack's sudden outburst. For a brief moment, the room was silent, the tension thickening in the air. Then, the hum grew louder. It was unbearable now, reverberating through the very walls of the helicopter, until it felt like the entire machine was vibrating with the sound. Jack's hand shot to the emergency transmission button, and he pressed it, hoping against hope that the signal would reach someone. But the button didn't respond. The system was completely dead. The hijackers watched him closely, but neither of them made a move. There was nothing else to do. Jack had to act fast. His eyes flicked to the mountainside just outside the window. The jagged cliffs were closing in on them, and if he didn't level them out soon, they'd be crashing right into them. His fingers danced across the controls, every second bringing them closer to disaster. Just then, the helicopter lurched violently, as if it had hit something invisible in the air. Jack's heart skipped a beat. What the hell was that? The vibration intensified. The entire helicopter seemed to shudder as the humming sound reached its peak. Then, nothing. Jack froze. The hum was gone. For a fleeting moment, everything was still. The chopper hung in the air, like a bird uncertain of where it wanted to land. The descent had stopped. But then, the lights flickered, and Jack realized with a sickening feeling that it wasn't over. The chopper was still falling. It wasn't just malfunctioning. It was being controlled. The hijackers were no longer paying attention to Jack. Their eyes were locked on the outside of the helicopter now, their faces full of disbelief. Jack knew they were not just going to crash. They were going to crash somewhere specific. And whatever was waiting for them down there in the mountains wasn't going to let them off easy. The helicopter was no longer a machine in flight. It was a wounded animal, struggling to stay aloft, its body trembling as if it were trying to resist its inevitable fall. The vibrations, the humming, the strange force pushing them downward. It was all too much for Jack to comprehend. He had been in tight spots before, but this was unlike anything he had ever experienced. What's happening? The smaller hijacker's voice broke through Jack's thoughts, sounding panicked, shrill. He was staring out of the window, his face ghostly white. We're gonna crash, man. We're gonna crash right into the mountains. Jack didn't respond. His hands were a blur over the controls, trying every manual override, every emergency system. But it was all in vain. The helicopter wasn't responding. The leader, whose calm demeanor had slipped into anxious irritation, was now pacing, his fingers twitching over his gun. He glanced at the controls, at Jack, at the other hijacker. His expression filled with frustration. You're the pilot. Fix it, he growled, his voice low, threatening. But his eyes were filled with panic now. Jack could see it. But Jack couldn't fix this. Not on his own. The small hijacker, desperate now, whipped around. There's gotta be something you can do. He gripped his rifle, his hands shaking. What's going on? Where's the emergency landing spot? Jack's heart raced. The truth was, there was no emergency landing zone. He had been flying in a remote part of the mountains, far from any civilization. The terrain was too rugged, the cliffs too jagged. They were essentially on their way to a crash landing. There was no way to stop it. He turned to the hijacker, keeping his voice as calm as possible. There's no place to land. We need to brace for impact. The smaller hijacker's face went pale, and he looked to the leader, seeking some kind of reassurance. But the leader had no words of comfort. He was just as lost as they were. As the chopper descended, the mountains grew larger in their view. Sharp, unforgiving peaks that seemed to rise from the earth like teeth. The sound of the humming intensified again, an almost oppressive presence in the air, vibrating the entire helicopter. It was as though the very landscape itself was alive, manipulating them, drawing them in. Jack gritted his teeth, trying not to let the rising terror take hold of him. His thoughts flashed back to his training, to everything he had learned about emergency landings. But nothing in his years of experience prepared him for this. No textbook, no simulator had ever accounted for the strange hum that seemed to control everything. Do you hear that? The leader's voice trembled slightly, his eyes darting back to Jack. What is that noise? Jack didn't answer. The hum was now so loud it drowned out everything else. The sound seemed to grow, like a choir of voices building to a deafening crescendo. And then, the sudden silence. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the entire world. The helicopter's shaking stopped. The hum was gone. Everything fell eerily still. But Jack knew they weren't safe. The silence was the calm before the storm. The helicopter was still plummeting. Jack's fingers were pressed against the collective control with all his strength, but he couldn't slow their descent. The control wasn't responding. They were being pulled down by something unseen. His eyes flicked to the window. The mountain range below them was close now, too close. The helicopter was nearly at ground level. He had seconds left. We're done for, the small hijacker whispered, almost to himself. He had stopped trying to help, stopped fighting the descent. He looked like a man already resigned to his fate. Jack swallowed hard. He had to do something, anything, to make sure at least some of them survived. His fingers hovered over the emergency ejection system, but before he could engage it, a voice crackled through his headset, cutting through the eerie silence of the cockpit. "Pilot Jack Turner, this is Agent 13. Do not engage any manual overrides. We are in control of the situation." Jack froze. The voice was calm, authoritative, and completely unexpected. He quickly checked his headset. There was no interference, no static. The voice was coming through clear, and it sounded like it was coming from an official channel. "What?" Jack asked, his voice barely audible. "Who is this?" "Agent 13, the voice repeated. "I said, do not engage any manual overrides. We've taken control of your descent. You are not in control of this flight anymore. Brace for impact. The crash site is designated. We have already prepared." Jack's mind spun. What was going on? Who was Agent 13? Why were they intervening? And how in the hell did they have control of the helicopter? The hijackers were silent now, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. They hadn't heard this voice, hadn't understood what was happening. But Jack did. They weren't just being hijacked anymore. They were being manipulated by someone, something with resources far beyond anything he could comprehend. "We'll guide you to safety once the crash landing is complete," Agent 13 continued. "Stay calm and follow instructions." Instructions? Jack's heart pounded. He had no choice but to listen. His options were gone. He couldn't fight whatever force had control of this helicopter. The descent was nearing its end. He glanced down, only a few hundred feet above the rocky terrain now. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to take control, to fight back. But as his fingers hovered over the control panel, the humming returned. This time, it wasn't just a hum. It was a warning. "Brace for impact," the voice from the headset repeated. Jack had no choice but to do what he was told. He reached for the emergency harness, clicking it tight, his breath shallow. He glanced at the hijackers. Both were watching him now, their faces full of dread. In the distance, a clearing appeared. But it wasn't just any clearing. It was unnatural. The space was perfectly shaped, as though someone had prepared it for them. Jack swallowed hard as the helicopter hurtled toward it, the ground rushing up beneath them. The vibrations shook the air. The helicopter was nearing its final destination. And then, the world went black. The world exploded into chaos. The helicopter slammed into the ground with a sickening crunch. Metal tore through the earth, and the roar of the crash was deafening. Jack's body was thrown forward, his harness the only thing keeping him in place. The impact was so violent it felt as though the very air was being ripped apart. He could hear the sound of the rotors tearing off, the sharp screech of metal twisting, and the unbearable groaning of the helicopter as it skidded across the rocky terrain. Everything was a blur. His vision blurred with the sudden shock, and his ears rang with the force of the crash. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness, the overwhelming silence after the storm. Then, slowly, he began to register the reality of what had just happened. The helicopter had come to a violent stop, its nose buried deep into the rocky ground. The front of the fuselage was crumpled, the control panels cracked and shattered. The wreckage was a mess of twisted metal, but somehow, miraculously, the main body of the chopper had survived the crash intact. Jack's chest was heaving, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The harness had dug into his shoulders, but he was still alive. Barely. He blinked, trying to clear the daze from his mind. The other hijackers were still in their seats, though they were either unconscious or badly dazed. The smaller one groaned, his head tilted back at an awkward angle. The leader was slumped forward, his body twisted, his gun still in his hand. Get up, Jack muttered to himself, his hands shaking as he reached for the release mechanism. The crash had rattled him, but he had no time to dwell on the pain. He needed to move. With a final, strained effort, Jack pulled himself free from the harness. He staggered out of his seat, his legs unsteady, as though the world was still spinning around him. The air outside was thick with dust, the remnants of the crash swirling around them like a fog. Through the cracked windshield, he could see the surrounding landscape, a barren, rocky stretch of wilderness. The clearing where they had crashed wasn't just any regular clearing. It looked too perfect, too planned. There were no signs of life. No sign of civilization for miles. Just the silent, unnerving stretch of jagged mountains and rough terrain. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This was no random crash. This had been set up. Someone had planned this. He wasn't just an unlucky pilot caught in a hijacking. He was a pawn in something much bigger. He moved quickly, pushing past the wreckage toward the door. It was stuck, but after a few hard shoves, it finally gave way, groaning as it opened. He stepped into the dust and debris, the dry air biting at his skin. Jack looked around, searching for anything. Any sign that they weren't alone here. The sound of the wind howling across the barren land was the only thing he could hear. He squinted into the distance, his mind racing. What was going on? Who was responsible for this? As he moved farther away from the wreckage, Jack's thoughts returned to the mysterious voice on the radio. Agent 13. Who the hell were they? And what did they want with him? But there was no time to dwell on it. The hijackers, both of them, would be waking up soon, and Jack needed to be ready for whatever came next. He paced around the crash site, trying to get a better look at his surroundings. There were no roads, no signs of life, nothing but the harsh wilderness surrounding him. It felt like they had been dropped into the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound behind him. Jack spun around, heart leaping into his throat. His hand instinctively went to his side, reaching for the gun he had left behind in the wreckage. But it was too late. A figure emerged from the dust. A tall man, dressed in dark tactical gear, his face obscured by a black mask. Jack's instincts kicked in, and he took a step back, but the man raised his hand in a calm, deliberate gesture. "Don't move," the man said, his voice muffled but firm. "You're not going anywhere." Jack froze. His eyes narrowed. The man had come from nowhere, and Jack hadn't even heard him approach. He was in no position to fight or run. The man stepped closer, his boots crunching over the rocky ground. Jack could see the faint glint of a high-tech gadget on his wrist, something that looked more advanced than anything Jack had ever seen. "We've been expecting you," the man continued, his eyes hidden beneath the mask. "Agent 13 was right. You're the key to the next phase." Jack's blood ran cold. Expecting him? What did that mean? Before he could ask, another voice cut through the silence. One Jack recognized all too well. "You're too late." The leader of the hijackers had stumbled out of the wreckage, his hand clutching his side. He was bloody, bruised, but still alive. "You think you can just control us? You're not in charge here. We have the power." The man in the tactical gear ignored him, his gaze fixed on Jack. "The situation has already changed," he said, "and you're not in control anymore." Jack's mind raced. He had no idea what these people wanted, but it was clear now that they weren't just some random group of criminals. Whoever had set this crash in motion had known exactly what they were doing, and they wanted Jack for something. But what? The man stepped even closer, his eyes locking onto Jack's. "You'll find out soon enough. But for now, we need to move. You have a role to play in what happens next." Jack's stomach turned. He was stuck in something much bigger than a hijacking. Whatever it was, he was already in too deep. And there was no turning back now. The figure gestured for him to follow, and Jack had no choice but to obey. There was no other option. As he moved to follow the man through the desolate terrain, Jack glanced back one last time at the wreckage. The helicopter, his lifeline, was gone, and with it, any sense of control he had once had. He was about to step into something far darker than he could have imagined. The man in tactical gear led Jack through the barren landscape, his movements swift and purposeful. Jack tried to keep up, though his legs still felt heavy from the crash and the shock of everything that had happened. He couldn't shake the image of the wreckage behind him, the twisted, broken metal that had once been his only lifeline. See, the leader of the hijackers was behind them, stumbling along in the dust, still nursing his side. He wasn't talking, but Jack could feel his eyes burning into the back of his neck. The hijacker was clearly trying to figure out what was going on, just like Jack was. Jack had so many questions, but the most pressing one was, what the hell is going on? He tried to catch the man in tactical gear's attention. "Where are we going? Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for Jack to keep moving. The rough terrain stretched out before them, an endless sea of jagged rocks and dust. The air was thin, and every step felt like a small battle against gravity. The temperature had dropped since the crash, and Jack felt a chill creeping up his spine. "You'll find out soon enough," the man said, his voice firm but impersonal. "We're not far now." Jack's mind raced. Whoever these people were, they had clearly been planning this for a long time. It wasn't just a random hijacking gone wrong. They had known who Jack was, where he was flying, and what he could do. And now, they were leading him into the wilderness with an agenda that was still a mystery. As they continued to move, Jack glanced back at the leader of the hijackers. The man was still watching him closely, his eyes narrowed, but Jack could sense his fear. The hijackers' bravado from earlier had dissolved. Now, all that remained was a man desperately trying to make sense of a situation he had no control over. Jack kept his eyes forward. He had to focus. There was no turning back now. He was deep into something he couldn't escape, and whatever it was much bigger than a simple hijacking. After what felt like hours of trudging through the rugged terrain, the man in tactical gear finally stopped. Jack nearly collided with him when he came to a sudden halt. Ahead of them was a large, black vehicle, an armored SUV, parked in the middle of nowhere. Its sleek, black exterior contrasted sharply with the surrounding desert-like landscape. A few more armed figures stood near the vehicle, watching them approach. They were dressed similarly to the man who had led Jack here. Tactical gear, masks, and weapons. There was a cold efficiency to their movements, like they had done this 1,000 times before. Jack's heart began to pound harder in his chest. This wasn't just a group of criminals. This was an operation. An organized, highly skilled operation. The man in tactical gear turned to face Jack, his eyes cold. "Get in the vehicle. We're taking you to the compound." Jack opened his mouth to protest, but he was interrupted by the leader of the hijackers. "You can't just take him." The hijacker's voice was sharp, filled with a mix of anger and fear. "You don't know who you're messing with. We're not just gonna." The man in tactical gear raised his hand, silencing the leader immediately. "You're out of your depth," he said coldly. "You're not in charge here, and you're in no position to make demands." Jack's eyes flicked between the man in tactical gear and the hijacker. The latter seemed to be sizing up his options, but Jack could see the truth in the other man's words. The hijacker was out of his league. Whatever was going on here, it wasn't a simple crime. They were dealing with something far more dangerous. The hijacker's face twisted with frustration, but he didn't argue further. He moved to the vehicle, still clutching his side, and climbed inside. Jack followed, his mind still racing. Once inside the vehicle, the doors slammed shut, and they began driving through the desolate landscape. The road, if it could even be called that, was rough, barely wide enough for the SUV. Jack sat in the back, his head spinning with questions. Where were they going? What did they want with him? And most importantly, who were they working for? The man in tactical gear sat in the front, his eyes focused on the road, and said nothing. Jack tried to engage him again, but the man remained silent, as though he had no interest in answering Jack's questions. The ride was long and quiet, the only sound being the hum of the engine and the crunch of the tires on the gravel road. Every bump and jolt made Jack's body ache, but he kept his gaze steady, determined to figure out what was going on. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now. After what seemed like an eternity, the vehicle finally came to a stop. Jack looked out the window, but he couldn't see much in the dimming light. The area around them was still just barren wilderness, stretching endlessly into the horizon. The door to the vehicle opened, and the man in tactical gear stepped out, followed by the leader of the hijackers, who was now looking more and more like a broken man. Jack hesitated for a moment before following them. They were at a small compound. The buildings were nondescript, low, squat structures made of reinforced steel. There was an air of secrecy about the place, like it had been hidden from the world on purpose. The perimeter was lined with high fences, and a few armed guards stood watch, their faces hidden behind masks, their weapons at the ready. Jack's heart thudded in his chest. This was it. This was where everything changed. As he stepped out of the vehicle, the man in tactical gear turned to him. This is where you'll learn why you're here. You'll be briefed shortly, but I'm going to warn you now. Whatever you think is going on, it's much bigger than you know. And your role in this, it's crucial." Jack's throat went dry. Crucial? What did that mean? The man's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of something, a dark promise in the other man's gaze. The hijackers had no idea what they had stumbled into, and neither did Jack, but he was about to find out. Jack followed the man in tactical gear into the compound, his pulse racing with every step. The compound was eerily quiet, save for the low hum of machinery in the background and the occasional sound of guards shifting behind the high metal fences. He couldn't shake the feeling that every step he took was being monitored, scrutinized by eyes he couldn't see. The leader of the hijackers had fallen into line behind him, his earlier bravado replaced with an uneasy silence. He was still clutching his side, the blood soaking through his jacket. Jack wondered if the man was even aware of how much trouble he was in, or if he was still just trying to salvage what little control he thought he had. They passed through a heavy, steel door that creaked ominously as it opened. The inside was just as bleak as the outside, bare walls, harsh fluorescent lights overhead, and an air that smelled faintly of disinfectant. Jack glanced around, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but the space was disorienting. It didn't feel like a typical facility. It felt more like a bunker, something hidden away from the world. A voice broke through the silence, sharp and commanding. "Bring him in." Jack's head snapped toward the source of the voice. At the far end of the hallway stood another figure, this one even more intimidating than the man in tactical gear who had led him here. The newcomer was dressed in a black suit, his demeanor cold and calculating. His sharp eyes locked onto Jack as he approached, and there was no warmth, no trace of humanity in his gaze. Just business. And danger. The man in the suit motioned for Jack to step forward. "Come with me. It's time you were briefed." Jack didn't hesitate. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a vice, but he couldn't afford to show any fear. Not now. He stepped forward, his boots echoing in the sterile hallway, the sound amplified by the cold silence of the compound. The director smiled, though it wasn't a pleasant smile. "Not mind control. That would be too simple. No, we are talking about a technology that can manipulate reality itself. A system that uses data, algorithms, and advanced artificial intelligence to predict and influence every move, every action, every decision." Jack felt his head spin. He had always known that technology was advancing rapidly, but this was something out of a sci-fi thriller. "And you think I'm the key?" Jack asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. The director nodded slowly. "You're more important than you realize. You see, you weren't just a random pilot on a routine flight. You were chosen. Your skill set, your knowledge, your unique position in the aviation industry, they're all part of the equation." Jack's mind reeled. Chosen? For what? The director continued, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "We need you to help us complete the project. We need you to fly a plane. A very specific plane. And we need you to be in the air when it happens." Jack's heart raced, and for the first time, he felt a cold sweat break out across his back. This wasn't just about surviving a hijacking anymore. This wasn't even about escaping this compound. This was about something far more dangerous, and Jack had just been roped into it. "You think you can just use me as a pawn in your game?" Jack snapped, his anger flaring. "You think you can force me into this?" The director's expression didn't change. He was unfazed. "You have no choice, Jack. None of us do. You'll help us, or you'll find out just how much power we really have." "It's not a threat, it's a fact." Jack's chest tightened. He was trapped. No matter what he did, there was no escaping this. "Think about it carefully," the director said, his voice smooth and confident. "You can play your part, or you can resist. Either way, we'll get what we need." Jack's mind raced as he sat there in silence. There was no way out. Not yet. But there had to be a way to turn the tables. The director stood and gestured for Jack to follow him. "It's time to meet the others. You'll see just how deep this goes." Jack had no choice but to follow. Jack followed the director down a long hallway, the soft echo of their footsteps blending with the hum of machinery. The silence between them was thick, as if the air itself was heavy with the weight of the conversation they had just had. Every part of him screamed to fight back, to escape, but he knew it was futile. They had control, and right now, he didn't. The director led him through a series of security doors, each one more high-tech than the last. As they passed, Jack caught glimpses of the people inside, guarding control panels, monitoring screens, adjusting equipment that Jack didn't even recognize. This wasn't a place of mere criminals or terrorists. This was something far more advanced, something that felt as though it belonged to a world that was beyond his understanding. Finally, they reached a large, sterile room with walls lined in steel. At the center of the room was a massive round table, and seated at it were several individuals. They all looked up when Jack entered, their expressions unreadable. Jack could sense that they were sizing him up, each of them curious about the newcomer. Him? "Take a seat, Mr. Walker," the director said smoothly, motioning to the empty chair at the table. Jack hesitated, his gaze scanning the room. There were 4 people seated at the table, 2 women and 2 men. One of the men looked to be in his mid-40s, his face sharp and calculating, his eyes hidden behind a pair of sleek glasses. The other man was younger, perhaps in his 30s, his hair shaved close to his head, a dark expression on his face. The older woman had a stern, no-nonsense air about her, her short black hair pulled tightly into a bun. The younger woman, by contrast, had a sharp, almost unsettling smile on her face, her eyes gleaming with an intelligence that made Jack uneasy. "Jack Walker," the director began, "meet the team. Each of them has played a crucial role in the development of our project. They will be working with you moving forward." Jack sat down in the chair, his hands clenched in his lap. He didn't want to be here, didn't want to be a part of whatever this was. But it was clear that resisting wasn't an option. The director gestured toward the older man in glasses. "This is Dr. Maxwell Cole. He's the brains behind the AI algorithms we've been developing." Dr. Cole nodded slightly, his eyes piercing Jack with a cold, analytical gaze. "It's a pleasure, Mr. Walker," he said in a voice that didn't seem to hold any warmth. The director then motioned to the younger man. "This is Dominic Harris. He's responsible for the security aspects of our operation." Dominic didn't say anything but simply nodded. His arms were crossed over his chest, his posture rigid and intimidating. Jack didn't feel comfortable around him, not with the way the man sized him up, like he was something to be dissected. The director moved to the older woman. "This is Agent Rachel Fox. She handles logistics and strategy." Agent Fox's eyes were sharp, assessing Jack as if she was already planning the next move in some unseen game. She didn't smile or offer a handshake. Instead, she just nodded at him, her gaze never wavering. Finally, the director gestured to the younger woman, who smiled at Jack with a strange, almost predatory look. "And this is Dr. Naomi Blake. She's the head of our research division." Dr. Blake's smile was unsettling, but her eyes sparkled with a kind of excitement Jack didn't understand. She was the first to speak. "We're all working toward a common goal, Mr. Walker. You're a key piece in our puzzle, whether you realize it or not. Our project is one of a kind. There's nothing like it in the world." Her voice was smooth, persuasive, almost too calm. Jack leaned back in his chair, trying to process everything he was hearing. Each person at the table had their own area of expertise, but they all seemed to have one thing in common. They were all playing a part in something that felt bigger than he could grasp. They were all part of a machine, a well-oiled operation, and Jack had been dragged right into its center. Dr. Cole cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension. "We've developed a system that can manipulate and predict events with frightening accuracy. Every detail, every piece of data, is analyzed in real time. We know how people will react, what they will do next, and even how the smallest decisions can change the outcome of larger events." Jack stared at him, his mind racing. "What does that mean? How are you doing this?" Dr. Cole didn't answer immediately, instead looking toward the director. The director gave a slight nod, and Dr. Cole continued. "We've tapped into something greater than traditional AI. We've designed algorithms that can learn, adapt, and even influence actions in real time. It's all about control, Mr. Walker. The ability to manipulate events on a global scale, to orchestrate them from the shadows." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Manipulate events? Control the world? The weight of what they were doing hit him all at once, and it was suffocating. This wasn't just a hijacking or a high-tech experiment. This was an attempt to shape the very fabric of reality. Dr. Blake's eyes glimmered with excitement as she leaned forward. And you, Jack, are the key to making this all come together. You're the pilot who can execute the final piece of the puzzle. You're going to help us launch the system, ensuring it reaches its full potential. Jack's mind spun as he tried to comprehend what they were saying. A pilot? I'm just a pilot. I'm not some key to their plan. The director watched him carefully, a hint of amusement on his face. You're not just any pilot, Mr. Walker. You're exactly the person we need. Jack swallowed hard. He could feel the walls closing in, the reality of his situation settling deep within him. You're not going to get away with this, Jack said through clenched teeth. Someone will stop you. Dr. Fox's expression softened for a fraction of a second, almost as if she were humoring him. You really think so, Mr. Walker? What makes you so sure? Jack looked at the faces of the people in the room, each of them so cold, so calculated. He could see the wheels turning in their minds, each one focused on their end goal. And in that moment, Jack realized just how far they were willing to go to make their plan a reality. The director leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. You'll understand soon enough, Mr. Walker. We all have our roles to play in this. Yours is simply flying the plane. The room fell silent, the weight of their words hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. Jack wasn't sure how he was going to escape this nightmare, but one thing was clear. He had to stay alive long enough to figure it out. For now, there was no way out. Jack sat in the sterile room, the harsh overhead lights casting a cold glow over everything. His mind was racing, trying to process what he had just heard. The director and his team had been clear. They were playing a game on a scale Jack had never even considered. Every word they spoke felt like it was pulling him deeper into their web, tightening around him like a noose. But Jack wasn't going to go down without a fight. His instincts as a pilot, his experience in high-pressure situations, told him to keep his cool, to wait, to find a way out. Dr. Blake was talking again, her voice smooth and calm. The plan is simple. You're going to be our eyes in the sky. You'll be the one who carries out the final phase of our operation. Jack clenched his fists in his lap, trying to hold back the fury that was bubbling inside him. And if I refuse? The room grew quiet for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The director's voice broke the silence, a cold smile curling on his lips. Refuse? That's not really an option, Mr. Walker. You've already been chosen. The system is in motion. You're part of it now. Jack's eyes flicked to each of them in turn. Dr. Cole, whose expression never changed. Dominic Harris, who was still standing by the wall, his arms crossed and eyes narrowed. Agent Fox, who had a look of quiet calculation on her face. They were all so sure of themselves, so confident. It sickened Jack to his core. We've designed a fail-safe, you see, the director continued, his voice low and almost soothing. If you attempt to leave, if you try to sabotage us in any way, we have contingencies in place. You won't be able to hide. Not from us. Jack swallowed hard, but didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew what they were saying. This isn't just about you, Mr. Walker, Dr. Blake added, her tone almost sympathetic. This is about the world. You're part of something much bigger than yourself. The system we've created is a force that can change everything. The way people think, the way governments act, the way the world responds to crises. It will all be influenced by the decisions we make. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to scream, to tell them they were mad. But he knew they weren't. They were too organized, too focused, too dangerous. The AI system we've built, Dr. Blake continued, has the potential to save lives, to avert disasters before they even happen. But it also has the power to take lives, to make events unfold in ways no one can predict. And that's why we need you, Mr. Walker. You're going to help us deploy it, to bring it to life. The director leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Jack's. Once the system is activated, the world will never be the same. We'll control the future. Jack's stomach churned. He didn't want to be a part of whatever they were planning. But it was clear. he didn't have a choice. What happens if I do what you want? Jack asked, his voice hoarse. What happens when this system is in place? The director's smile widened. We change the world. We eliminate threats before they even exist. We control the course of history. People will be safer, they'll be happier. But they won't know it, because they won't even be aware of the decisions we've made for them. Jack felt a sense of dread creep into his chest. This wasn't just about hijacking a plane. It wasn't even just about manipulating a single event. This was about rewriting history itself. We're ready, Agent Fox said, breaking Jack from his thoughts. The technology is in place. The final piece is you. The director stood, his chair scraping against the floor. You'll be briefed on the specifics soon enough, Mr. Walker. But for now, know this, you have a role to play. Don't disappoint us. With that, the room cleared. Jack was left alone, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with crushing force. The door clicked shut behind him, and he was locked in his thoughts, his mind spinning with everything he had just learned. He couldn't do this. He couldn't help them change the world like they wanted. But how could he fight back? What chance did he have against a system that already had control of everything? The answer was simple. He didn't have a chance. Not yet. But Jack wasn't going to give up that easily. The days following the meeting felt like a blur. Jack was trapped in a cycle of conflicting emotions. He couldn't stop thinking about the director's words, the cold certainty in their eyes. He knew they had control over every move he made, but what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Jack Walker wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. Every time he sat down, his mind raced. He replayed every conversation in his head, trying to find a weakness, a crack in their carefully constructed facade. But every time he thought he had a breakthrough, he was reminded of the consequences if he failed. Keep your head down, he told himself quietly as he stood in the small, sterile room they had assigned him. Wait for the right moment. But that moment seemed to stretch farther and farther out of reach. The director, Dr. Blake, Agent Fox, they were always around, always watching. And Jack's every move felt increasingly like a step in a game he didn't understand. It was a cold morning when the breakthrough finally came. Jack was pacing in his room when a knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. He opened it cautiously, expecting the usual Agent Fox or Dr. Cole. But standing before him was a face he hadn't seen in days, Dominic Harris. Mr. Walker, Dominic said, his voice low and guarded. We need to talk. Jack didn't hesitate. He stepped aside, allowing Dominic into the room. He could already feel the tension in the air, but he wasn't sure if it was from the pressure of the situation or something else entirely. Dominic didn't waste any time. Listen carefully, Jack, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. There's a way out of this, but it's going to require everything you've got. Jack raised an eyebrow, his heart racing. What are you talking about? Dominic leaned in closer, his eyes darting nervously to the door before returning to Jack. I've been watching them. The director and his people, they're more vulnerable than they let on. There's a hole in their plan, and if you can exploit it, you might be able to bring this whole thing down. Jack's mind raced. He wasn't sure if he could trust Dominic, but the thought of finally having a way out, of finally having a chance to do something, felt like a lifeline. What's the plan? Jack asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Dominic nodded, glancing around again to make sure no one was listening. The system they've built, the one they want you to help them deploy, it's relying on a single point of failure. It's a backdoor they've intentionally left open. If you can access it and sever their connection to the core system, everything will come crashing down. Jack's pulse quickened. He had no idea what Dominic was talking about, but one thing was clear. This was his chance. The system, the one they were using to control everything, had a vulnerability, and he was going to be the one to exploit it. The days following the meeting felt like a blur. Jack was trapped in a cycle of conflicting emotions. He couldn't stop thinking about the director's words, the cold certainty in their eyes. He knew they had control over every move he made, but what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Jack Walker wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. Every time he sat down, his mind raced. He replayed every conversation in his head, trying to find a weakness, a crack in their carefully constructed facade. But every time he thought he had a breakthrough, he was reminded of the consequences if he failed. "Keep your head down," he told himself quietly as he stood in the small, sterile room they had assigned him. Wait for the right moment. But that moment seemed to stretch farther and farther out of reach. The director, Dr. Blake, Agent Fox, they were always around, always watching. And Jack's every move felt increasingly like a step in a game he didn't understand. It was a cold morning when the breakthrough finally came. Jack was pacing in his room when a knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. He opened it cautiously, expecting the usual Agent Fox or Dr. Cole. But standing before him was a face he hadn't seen in days, Dominic Harris. "Mr. Walker," Dominic said, his voice low and guarded. "We need to talk." Jack didn't hesitate. He stepped aside, allowing Dominic into the room. He could already feel the tension in the air, but he wasn't sure if it was from the pressure of the situation or something else entirely. Dominic didn't waste any time. "Listen carefully, Jack," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's a way out of this, but it's going to require everything you've got." Jack raised an eyebrow, his heart racing. "What are you talking about?" Dominic leaned in closer, his eyes darting nervously to the door before returning to Jack. "I've been watching them. The director and his people, they're more vulnerable than they let on. There's a hole in their plan, and if you can exploit it, you might be able to bring this whole thing down." Jack's mind raced. He wasn't sure if he could trust Dominic, but the thought of finally having a way out, of finally having a chance to do something, felt like a lifeline. "What's the plan?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Dominic nodded, glancing around again to make sure no one was listening. "The system they've built, the one they want you to help them deploy, it's relying on a single point of failure. It's a backdoor they've intentionally left open. If you can access it and sever their connection to the core system, everything will come crashing down." Jack's pulse quickened. He had no idea what Dominic was talking about, but one thing was clear. This was his chance. The system, the one they were using to control everything, had a vulnerability, and he was going to be the one to exploit it. Agent Fox leaned forward, handing Jack a tablet. "You'll be flying a mission tomorrow. A routine drop-off, except it won't be. You'll be our eyes on the ground and in the sky." The final piece of the puzzle. Jack stared at the tablet, trying to ignore the nerves gnawing at him. He scanned the mission details, but the words blurred as his thoughts raced back to Dominic and the plan they devised. It was a simple mission on paper, but to Jack, it felt like walking into the lion's den. "Any questions?" the director asked, his eyes like ice. Jack hesitated for a moment before speaking. "What exactly do you want me to do once I'm airborne?" The director's lips curled into a smile. "You'll be following our orders. The AI will guide your every move. Your job is to make sure nothing goes wrong." Jack clenched his jaw. The AI, their precious system. He knew it was more than just a tool. It was their weapon. But tomorrow, he would have the chance to sever the connection. It would be his chance to strike. "Is everything in place?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Everything," Agent Fox confirmed. "And you'll be on your own. No one will be able to help you." A chill ran down Jack's spine. They weren't just controlling the system. They were controlling him. But this wasn't the time to show doubt. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Got it." As Jack walked out of the briefing room, the weight of the mission settled in his chest. Tomorrow would be the day. He had to plant the flash drive into their system. He had to break their hold before it was too late. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jack went through the motions, checking his gear, making sure everything was in order, but his mind kept returning to the plan. The moment of truth. The backdoor that would bring their system crashing down. That night, as he lay in bed, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The mission, the AI, the director, all of it. It was a game of life and death. And Jack wasn't sure if he was ready for the consequences of what he was about to do. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let this system take control of the world, not if it meant sacrificing everything he stood for. The following morning, Jack suited up and headed to the hangar. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his hands were steady. He climbed into the cockpit of the helicopter, his mind focused entirely on the task ahead. The moment he lifted off the ground, Jack knew there would be no turning back. The mission had started. The AI was watching his every move, and there was no room for error. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him as he guided the helicopter through the skies. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. The wind whipped past him, the hum of the helicopter's engines the only sound as he flew higher. But Jack's mind was elsewhere. He was calculating every second, every move, every potential danger. The flash drive, his only weapon against their control, was hidden in the secret compartment of his suit. He just needed to get to the system's central hub. Once there, he would plan it and activate the backdoor. But time was running out, and he could feel the clock ticking down. A voice crackled through his earpiece, cutting through his thoughts. "You're nearing the drop-off point. Stay on course, Mr. Walker." The director's voice. Cold, commanding. Jack gripped the controls tighter. This was it. But as he flew closer to the designated coordinates, something unexpected happened. The helicopter shuddered violently. Jack's heart skipped a beat as alarms blared in his ears. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, fighting to regain control. His eyes shot to the dashboard, trying to make sense of the situation. The AI had just overridden his controls. It was taking over. Jack's pulse surged as he realized what had just happened. The director had anticipated his move. The system wasn't just a passive tool. It was actively working against him. This wasn't just a mission. This was a trap. The helicopter jolted again, and Jack's grip on the controls tightened. The AI was no longer just a tool. It had become an adversary. Every instinct Jack had was screaming at him to regain control, but it was like fighting against a force stronger than anything he had ever encountered. The system was smarter than he anticipated. "Jack, listen to me." The voice in his earpiece crackled. It was Dr. Blake, calm and detached as always. "You've been compromised. The system knows what you're trying to do." Jack's blood ran cold. "You knew? All along?" There was a pause, and when Dr. Blake spoke again, her tone was almost pitying. "You think you're the first one to try something like this? You've been playing into our hands from the beginning. All of your moves have been calculated. Every step you take is under our control." The truth hit Jack like a freight train. The mission, the supposed opportunity to bring down the system, it had all been a setup. He had walked right into the trap they had laid for him. His every move had been anticipated. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jack spat, his pulse pounding in his ears. The helicopter was descending faster than he wanted. Its systems locked in place, taking him closer and closer to the ground. "You really thought you were the one pulling the strings?" Dr. Blake's voice was a mocking whisper now. "You were never in control. We've been watching you every step of the way. The system is ours, and you're just another pawn. Now, you'll do what you were always meant to do, complete the mission." Jack's world tilted. His breath quickened, and for the first time since he had started this mission, he felt the crushing weight of failure. Everything he had worked for, everything he had hoped to achieve, had been manipulated into this singular moment. He had been nothing more than a cog in their grand machine. "No," Jack muttered to himself, fighting the overwhelming sense of dread that threatened to consume him. "No, this can't be how it ends." But the helicopter was plunging toward the ground now, faster than Jack could pull it back. The AI had taken full control. He was trapped, locked inside a system that was designed to break him. Then, as the ground loomed closer, a new voice broke through the static in his earpiece. It was Dominic. "Jack, don't listen to her." Dominic's voice was urgent, filled with an intensity Jack had never heard before. "I'm in position. I've found a way to hack into the AI. I can help you. Just trust me." Jack's eyes darted to the controls. The helicopter was rapidly descending, but Dominic's words offered a glimmer of hope, a lifeline he wasn't ready to let go of. "I thought you said you were working with them." Jack shouted over the roar of the engines. "I wasn't. I was pretending, Jack. I've been feeding them false information." "I knew they were watching me too," Dominic replied quickly. "You can break free. I'm sending you the override code now. Hold on." Jack's hands flew over the console as the override code flashed on the screen. He had no time to question the sudden shift in Dominic's allegiance. He just had to act. With shaky hands, Jack typed in the code, praying that it would work. Every part of his body screamed in protest as the helicopter dropped closer to the ground, but he refused to let it end like this. He had come too far to fail now. For a moment, nothing happened. The descent continued. The AI's grip on the helicopter seemed unshakable. But just when it seemed like all was lost, Jack felt a flicker of resistance. The helicopter's systems paused, then rebooted. Slowly, agonizingly, the controls came back to life under Jack's hands. He felt the weight of the machine shift, as if it was waking up, realizing it wasn't in control anymore. "Dominic," Jack gasped, his voice hoarse with relief. "It's working. It's working." "Good," Dominic's voice came through, a quiet determination in his words. "But you've got to land this thing, Jack. You can't stay in the air much longer. They're going to come for you, and if you don't land soon, it'll be over." Jack's mind raced. He still couldn't believe what he had just learned, that everything he had been doing, every decision he had made, had been orchestrated by the people he had trusted. But for now, he pushed the thought aside. He had to focus. He had to survive. He pulled the helicopter back up slightly, guiding it toward an open field below. The ground was approaching rapidly, but Jack felt a surge of energy course through him. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. As the helicopter touched down with a heavy thud, Jack slammed the throttle to 0, the rotor blades slowing with a deafening whine. He had made it. He was still alive. For a moment, Jack sat there, panting, his heart racing as the world around him began to settle. But he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The mission had failed, but there was still time. Dominic's help had given him a chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. He grabbed the flash drive from his suit pocket and looked out the window, scanning for any signs of pursuit. They weren't far behind. Jack didn't waste a second. The moment the helicopter came to a full stop, he was out of the cockpit, sprinting across the field toward the dense woods on the edge of the landing site. He could hear the faint hum of engines in the distance. They were coming for him. Fast. His mind raced, calculating his next move. He could no longer trust anyone at the facility, and the director's words echoed in his head like a haunting reminder. You were never in control. The betrayal had stung more than he expected, but there was no time for regret. He had to think of his next move, or he'd be dead before he knew it. Dominic's voice crackled in his earpiece, low and urgent. "Jack, I'm tracking your position. You need to keep moving. They know you're not dead yet." Jack pushed harder, his legs burning as he cut through the tall grass, trying to stay as low as possible. The field was wide open, and he could hear the whir of helicopters in the distance. There was no way they hadn't picked up on his crash landing by now. "Where do I go?" Jack panted, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's a safe house nearby. I'll guide you there. Just keep moving. They'll be on the ground in less than 10 minutes. The urgency in Dominic's voice sharpened Jack's focus. He kept running, ignoring the exhaustion threatening to slow him down. He didn't have the luxury of slowing down. If the director wanted him alive, it was only to make him a pawn in their game. If Jack wanted to stay free, he had to make sure he stayed one step ahead. His pulse thudded in his temples as he reached the tree line. The dense woods would provide some cover, but as he pushed deeper into the shadows of the forest, a loud crack echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, every muscle in his body coiled and ready to spring. But it was too late. A figure emerged from the underbrush, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. It was Agent Fox. "You didn't think you could just run, did you, Jack?" Fox's voice was cold and confident, but there was something unsettlingly calm about him now. Jack had always known Fox was dangerous, but now, with the stakes higher than ever, the agent seemed even more of a threat. "Fox," Jack said, trying to steady his breathing. He had to think fast. "I'm not your pawn." Fox didn't reply. Instead, he reached for his gun, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. Jack's heart pounded harder as he realized Fox wasn't here to talk. He was here to finish the job. Before Jack could react, Fox's hand shot out. But it wasn't a gunshot that followed. It was a sharp, electric snap. Jack's body convulsed as a powerful jolt of electricity coursed through him, his muscles seizing against his will. "You really are naive," Fox muttered. watching Jack struggle to stay conscious as the electric shock overwhelmed him. You never had a chance. The director has already planned for your failure. You were never meant to win. Jack's vision blurred, and the forest around him seemed to spin. He fought against the overwhelming pain, trying to reach for the flash drive in his pocket, but his limbs felt like dead weight. The mission had failed. It was all slipping through his fingers. But just as the world around him began to fade, the earpiece crackled to life again. Jack, get up. Now. It was Dominic. The urgency in his voice cut through the fog in Jack's mind like a lifeline. With all the strength he could muster, Jack gritted his teeth, refusing to give in. He couldn't let Fox or anyone else take him down, not after everything he had fought for. Jack gathered the last of his energy, summoning every ounce of willpower to roll to his side. He grabbed the flash drive, his fingers trembling, and pressed it deep into his pocket. He couldn't let them get it. It was the only thing that could turn the tide in his favor. Fox moved in, a smirk on his face as he reached for Jack's wrist, pinning him to the ground. You're finished. No one can save you now. But Jack wasn't finished. Not yet. With a surge of adrenaline, Jack twisted his body, using the last bit of his strength to kick Fox off him. He scrambled to his feet, desperate to put some distance between himself and the agent. His legs felt like lead, but he forced himself forward, dodging through the trees as fast as his body would allow. Fox cursed behind him, but Jack didn't look back. He couldn't. He had no idea how much time he had before reinforcements showed up. The flash drive was still safe, but it wouldn't be for long if he didn't get to that safe house Dominic mentioned. His breaths were ragged as he pushed through the underbrush, every branch and rock an obstacle in his path. But the sound of pursuit was growing fainter. Maybe Fox had given up, maybe he hadn't. Either way, Jack knew he couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Dominic, I'm close, Jack gasped, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Where is it? The safe house. Keep going. It's just ahead. Dominic's voice came through, firm and reassuring. You're almost there. Jack didn't know if he could trust Dominic completely, but in that moment, he didn't have a choice. He had to keep running. If the director's men caught him now, everything he had worked for would be lost. And Jack couldn't let that happen. The forest seemed endless, each step heavier than the last as Jack pushed through the undergrowth. His body was screaming for rest, but there was no time to stop. He had learned the hard way that stopping meant getting caught. Fox was relentless, and the others would be closing in soon. Dominic's voice came through the earpiece, barely a whisper now, as if he, too, was afraid of being overheard. Jack, just a little farther. It's hidden well, but you have to be quick. They'll be tracking you. Jack nodded, even though he knew Dominic couldn't see him. The safe house was his only hope now. If he could make it there, he might have a chance to regroup, make a plan, and figure out how to escape the mess he was tangled in. But he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He had no idea what was waiting for him when he arrived. The trees began to thin as he neared a clearing, and Jack's breath hitched in his throat. He could see the faint outline of a structure in the distance, just a shack, nestled between a cluster of trees. It was small, but it was the only thing that stood between him and whatever came next. As Jack approached, he instinctively dropped to a crouch, scanning the area for any signs of danger. There was no movement, no sound. Good. Go inside, Dominic urged. I'll lock down the signal. You'll be safe for now. Jack hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The area was too quiet, the air too still. But his exhaustion and the constant pressure to keep moving overpowered his instincts. He stood up and made his way toward the shack. Each step was calculated, but every instinct told him to be cautious, to wait. He reached the door, and to his surprise, it wasn't locked. The hinges creaked as he pushed it open, stepping inside. The room was small, sparsely furnished. Just a single chair, a small table, and a cot in the corner. But Jack didn't care about the conditions. It was secure, for now. At least he had a roof over his head and a chance to breathe. He moved toward the table, where an old computer sat. Jack's fingers hesitated over the keyboard, but before he could start, the earpiece crackled to life again. Jack, stop. Dominic's voice was frantic. Don't touch that computer. It's a trap? A cold chill washed over Jack as he froze in place. What do you mean, a trap? The safe house, it was never safe. They've been monitoring you. Everything you do is being tracked. Even this conversation. Jack spun around, his eyes darting to the corners of the room. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air thick with tension. He had been set up again. They were always one step ahead. Get out of there. Now. Dominic's voice was sharp with urgency. Jack didn't need to be told twice. His mind raced as he turned toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, the sound of approaching footsteps froze him in his tracks. He couldn't leave now. Not yet. His pulse thundered in his ears as he scanned the room for another way out. The small window on the far wall caught his attention. It was high, just out of reach, but Jack's instincts kicked in. He moved toward it, his mind already calculating how he could escape. But as his fingers brushed the window, the unmistakable sound of gunfire shattered the silence. Jack ducked instinctively, the bullets slamming into the wood just inches from where he had been standing. He cursed under his breath, spinning to face the door. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He was trapped. Dominic, I need help now. Jack's voice was a raw whisper as he backed into the corner, his eyes darting to the window again. I'm working on it. Just stay low. They won't be able to get in without setting off an alarm. Don't let them know you're in there. Jack's heart raced as he crouched by the window, silently willing the seconds to stretch on. He needed a way out. But every time he thought he had a plan, the walls seemed to close in. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. He could hear them breathing, the soft shuffle of boots against the dirt. They were waiting for him to make a move. He had no choice. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, Jack scrambled for the small table, flipping it over to provide cover. The gunfire outside started again, hitting the walls, but Jack kept his head down. The pain in his chest from running, the exhaustion of the last few days, all of it seemed distant as he focused on survival. I need you to move fast, Jack, Dominic's voice snapped through the earpiece. There's a secondary exit under the floorboards. Get to it. Jack's hands shot to the ground, fingers prying at the edge of the wooden floor. His palms were slick with sweat, but the boards began to lift with a creaking protest. The moment he saw the hole beneath, Jack didn't hesitate. He dropped into the small space below, the floorboards snapping back into place above him. The safe house had been compromised, but Jack wasn't going down without a fight. The ground beneath Jack was damp and cool, the air musty and heavy with the smell of old wood. He forced himself to remain still, listening for the sound of footsteps above him. The tension in the air was almost suffocating, and his heart thudded painfully in his chest. He couldn't afford to make a sound. The dim light that filtered down through the cracks in the floorboards gave him just enough visibility to see the narrow tunnel beneath the shack. It was cramped, the walls close enough that he could almost touch both sides with his elbows. But it was a way out. Jack moved cautiously, staying low to the ground, his fingers brushing the cool stone walls of the tunnel as he crept forward. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to push forward as fast as possible. But he knew better. He had learned the hard way that rushing only made things worse. His mind was spinning. How had they known about the safe house? Had someone tipped them off? Was Dominic compromised? There were too many unanswered questions, too many things he couldn't control. But there was no time to dwell on it now. As he moved deeper into the tunnel, Jack's thoughts kept drifting back to the events that had led him here. The hijackers, the helicopters, the chase. It felt like a lifetime ago that he was just a regular pilot, living a life without constant fear. But everything had changed when that fateful day had arrived, the day that had set this entire nightmare into motion. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft click, faint, but unmistakable. Jack froze. He knew that sound, the unmistakable click of a safety being switched off. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he strained to listen. There was someone in the tunnel with him. His hand instinctively reached for the gun at his side, his fingers trembling. The path ahead was dark, too dark to see clearly, but he could sense movement. The shadow of a figure seemed to blend with the darkness around them. Dominic? Jack whispered, barely a breath. No response, just the faint sound of shifting footsteps. His mind raced. Was it one of the hijackers? Or was it someone else entirely? The tension in the air felt like it was building to a breaking point. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, and the sound of his own breathing seemed unnaturally loud. He couldn't tell if the footsteps were getting closer or if he was just imagining it. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He was not alone. He had to move. But where? Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own breath. Jack's eyes darted around in the dark, trying to make out any sign of movement. There was no way to tell how many people were in the tunnel with him, or even if they were friend or foe. The silence stretched on, and Jack's mind raced. Should he stay hidden? Should he confront whatever was coming toward him? Before he could make a decision, a voice broke the silence, low and cold, like a whisper in the dark. "I know you're there, Jack." The voice was familiar. Too familiar. Jack's blood ran cold as he recognized the name. "Fox," he muttered under his breath. The man who had been hunting him for what felt like an eternity. The man who had been the mastermind behind the hijacking. The one who had orchestrated every move, every twist and turn in this nightmare. Fox had found him. "You've been running for so long," Fox continued, his voice oozing with amusement. "But it's over now. There's nowhere to hide." Jack's mind was racing. He had no backup, no allies nearby. The only option was to face Fox head-on. "Why are you doing this?" Jack called out, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "What do you want from me?" Fox laughed softly, the sound echoing in the narrow tunnel. "It's never been about you, Jack. It's about power. Control. You're just a pawn in a much bigger game." Jack's grip tightened on his gun. He was no pawn. "If you're so sure of yourself, come out and face me," Jack taunted, hoping to buy himself a moment of clarity. "Or are you too scared to fight like a man?" Fox's response came quickly, too quickly. A loud crash echoed down the tunnel as Fox lunged at him, and Jack barely had time to react. His hand shot up, blocking the blow with his forearm, but the force of the impact sent him stumbling backward. The gun slipped from his hand, falling into the darkness. Jack cursed, adrenaline surging as he fought to regain his footing. Fox wasn't just a hunter, he was a predator. And Jack had just walked straight into his trap. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Fox growled, his voice dangerously close now. "But it won't be enough." Jack's thoughts raced. The tunnel was too narrow for a full-on fight, and there was nowhere to run. But he wasn't about to go down without a fight. His eyes flicked around in the darkness, searching for anything that could give him an advantage. Suddenly, his hand landed on something cold and metal. A rock, jagged and sharp, nestled against the wall. He grabbed it, his fingers wrapping tightly around it as he spun, aiming for the last place he'd heard Fox. With a swift motion, Jack hurled the rock in Fox's direction, using the distraction to dive for his gun. The shot rang out, but it wasn't Jack who fired. The gunshot rang through the narrow tunnel, deafening in the silence that followed. Jack's heart skipped a beat, and for a split second, he thought it was his own shot. But as the echo of the sound died down, he realized something wasn't right. He hadn't fired. His fingers tightened around the cold metal of the gun now in his hand, and he slowly rose to his feet, eyes darting through the darkness. The air felt thick, heavy with the tension of what was to come. Fox was still out there. Fox. Jack's voice was low, hoarse. He strained to hear any movement, any sound, but the tunnel was eerily still. For a moment, Jack thought he might be alone. But then he heard it, a soft laugh, a sound that sent chills down his spine. Well, Jack," Fox's voice slithered from the shadows. "It seems you're not as smart as you think you are." Before Jack could react, a figure appeared in the dim light, moving like a shadow. It wasn't Fox. It was a woman. Her face was partially obscured by a dark hood, but there was no mistaking the aura of danger that surrounded her. She was tall, lean, and moved with the kind of grace that made Jack think she wasn't just some ordinary assassin. She was something else entirely. She had the same cold, calculating look in her eyes as Fox, and it was clear from the gun she was pointing directly at Jack that she was no ally. Jack didn't lower his own gun. His eyes never left hers as he calculated his next move. She wasn't the only one in the tunnel. He could feel it, the presence of someone else just beyond the light. "You're not Fox," Jack said, his voice steady. "No," she replied, her lips curling into a faint, almost amused smile. "But Fox has sent me to finish what he started." The tension in the air was thick, and Jack's mind raced. He couldn't trust anyone in this place. Every shadow seemed to hold a new threat. Every creak of the tunnel's walls was another reminder that he was on his own. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his grip tightening on the gun. "What do you want?" The woman tilted her head, as though considering his question for a moment before responding. "We want the same thing, Jack. We want the truth." Jack's brow furrowed in confusion. The truth? What truth? There was only one truth he cared about at this moment: survival. But before he could respond, the woman stepped closer, her movements too quick for him to track. In an instant, she was standing just a few feet away from him, the barrel of her gun now pressed against his chest. "You have no idea what's at stake," she continued, her voice icy. "Fox isn't the one you should be worried about. You're in far deeper than you realize." Jack's heart raced as he tried to process her words. She was right. Everything had started with the hijacking, the lives that had been lost, the chase that had led him across the country. But now, it seemed like there was a much larger game being played, and Jack was just a pawn in it. "Then tell me what I'm supposed to do," Jack said, his voice tight with frustration. He couldn't keep playing these games. He needed answers. He needed to know who was pulling the strings. The woman's lips twisted into a cruel smile as she stepped back, lowering her gun. "You've already done your part, Jack," she said, her voice almost a whisper now. "Now it's time to figure out who you really are." Before Jack could react, the sound of footsteps echoed down the tunnel. The woman tensed, her eyes narrowing. Jack barely had time to process what was happening before the tunnel exploded into chaos. Fox's voice rang out, filled with fury. "I told you to leave him alive." The woman's expression faltered for a moment, as though she hadn't expected him to show up so soon. But it was enough. The brief distraction was all Jack needed. In one fluid motion, he lunged toward the woman, knocking the gun out of her hand. The two of them grappled, rolling across the cold stone floor of the tunnel, each struggling for dominance. Jack's breath was ragged, his muscles screaming with exhaustion, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He had been running for too long, hiding from too many people. But now, it was time to confront whatever demons were lurking in the shadows. Suddenly, the tunnel was filled with blinding light as figures appeared from the darkness. Men, women, dozens of them. Jack's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was an ambush. The woman had managed to push him off her, but Jack was already scrambling for his gun. As he rolled to his feet, he realized he had no choice. He wasn't going to make it out of this tunnel alive if he didn't act fast. He raised his weapon, aiming for the first figure he could see in the light. But before he could pull the trigger, a voice, deep, commanding, and cold, rang out, stopping him dead in his tracks. "Jack, drop your weapon." Jack's grip tightened around the gun. His mind screamed at him to fight, to run, but his body froze. He knew that voice. It was Dominic. The world around Jack seemed to freeze. The tunnel, the lights, the figures emerging from the darkness. Everything fell away as his mind locked onto the voice. Dominic. The man who had been his ally, his confidant, the one person Jack had trusted in this chaotic world. But now, as Dominic stepped into the flickering light, gun in hand, Jack's stomach churned. His heart raced, his breath shallow, as the truth of what was happening sank in. "Dominic, no," Jack muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He could barely find the words. Betrayal hit harder than any punch. It was the kind of pain that left you questioning everything you thought you knew. Dominic stood there, his expression unreadable. The cold metal of his gun gleamed in the low light, and his eyes, those eyes that Jack had once trusted, now seemed distant, calculating. "Put it down, Jack," Dominic ordered, his voice flat. No emotion, no warmth, just cold command. "This doesn't have to end in violence." Jack's grip on his own gun tightened. He wasn't going to lower it. Not yet. Not until he understood what was happening. Why, Dominic? Jack's voice cracked with disbelief. Why are you doing this? Dominic didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly at the woman Jack had just fought with. She had already regained her footing and was moving toward the back of the tunnel, slipping into the shadows once more. Her role in all of this was still unclear, but Jack had no illusions. She was part of it, part of something much larger than he had ever imagined. Things aren't always what they seem, Jack, Dominic said, his tone quieter now, almost as if he were explaining something to a child. You've been running blindly, trying to play the hero, but you have no idea what you're really up against. Jack's mind raced. The questions were coming faster than he could process them. Why was Dominic here on the opposite side? What had changed? What could possibly have been so important that Dominic had turned against him? You've been lying to me this whole time, Jack muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Everything, every step, it was all a game to you? Dominic's face hardened. It was never about you, Jack. You were never the target. You were just a pawn, a useful tool in a much bigger plan. A sinking feeling filled Jack's chest as the weight of Dominic's words hit him. He wasn't the one they had been after. He had been a distraction, a tool to be used and discarded when no longer needed. You've been working with Fox, haven't you? Jack spat, his voice laced with disgust. This whole thing, this hijacking, the helicopter crash, it was all planned. From the very beginning. Dominic didn't flinch. His gaze was steady as he looked at Jack, like he was explaining something inevitable, something that had been written long before they'd ever crossed paths. You don't understand the bigger picture, Jack, Dominic said, his voice low and controlled. Fox isn't the true threat. He's just a part of it. But you've been too focused on the wrong things to see what's really at stake. Jack's mind was reeling. What could be bigger than everything they had already been through? What was the real game here? He had spent so long trying to figure out why they were after him, but now it seemed like the answer was much darker, much more twisted than he had ever imagined. I'm trying to protect you, Jack, Dominic continued, his voice strangely soft now. Everything I've done for a reason. You can't see it yet, but you will. You'll understand soon enough. Jack felt the anger building inside him, but he tamped it down. His mind was too sharp to let emotions cloud his judgment now. He couldn't afford to be rash. Then explain it to me, Dominic, Jack said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind inside his chest. Explain what's going on. What the hell is really happening here? Dominic sighed, his expression hardening once again. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Jack's eyes narrowed. Try me. The silence between them felt suffocating. For a moment, neither of them moved, locked in a standoff in the dimly lit tunnel. Jack's mind spun with questions, but all of them seemed to lead back to the same place. The fact that he had been lied to, manipulated, and pushed into this nightmare without ever knowing the truth. Finally, Dominic spoke again, his voice almost a whisper. There are people who will stop at nothing to control this country, Jack. And they've been using people like you and me as pawns to push their agenda. You've been chasing ghosts, fighting battles that were never yours to fight. And now, you're caught in the middle of a war that's already been decided. Jack shook his head, unable to comprehend the depth of what Dominic was saying. So what? You're working with Fox to help these people? Is that what this is about? Dominic's gaze darkened, his grip on the gun tightening. It's bigger than Fox. It's bigger than both of us. Jack's stomach churned. The sense of betrayal was suffocating, but he couldn't afford to let it consume him. He had to focus, had to think, had to survive. We're not done here, Jack said, his voice cold and sharp. I'm not walking away until I have answers. And I'm sure as hell not letting you get away with this. Dominic's eyes flicked toward the woman in the shadows again, and for a moment, Jack saw something flash across his face. Something like regret. But it was gone just as quickly as it had come. You won't have to, Dominic replied quietly, because you won't be walking away at all. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Jack's heart raced, his thoughts spinning in a blur. The shadows that clung to the walls of the tunnel seemed to stretch and twist as if reflecting the chaos inside his mind. Dominic's betrayal was one thing, but this was a whole new level of deception. A conspiracy that spanned further than Jack could ever have imagined. The woman, still hidden in the darkness, stepped forward slowly, her presence like a dark omen. Her face remained obscured, but Jack could feel her eyes on him, cold, calculating. He didn't know who she was, but he could sense the danger she posed. "Why are you helping them?" Jack demanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "What are you involved in, really?" Dominic didn't flinch. His eyes were locked on Jack, and for a moment, Jack could almost see the conflict in his friend's eyes. Was this regret? Or was it simply the mask of someone who had long since stopped caring about loyalty, trust, or friendship? "The truth is," Dominic said, his tone unwavering, "you never stood a chance. From the moment you got involved, you were already too deep. And now, you're just a liability." Jack's blood boiled at the words. A liability? He had fought for what was right, fought for the truth, even when it seemed impossible. And now Dominic was standing here, telling him that all of it had been in vain? "You don't have to do this," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "You can walk away. Whatever game you're playing, it doesn't have to end like this." Dominic gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you, Jack? I already tried walking away. But you can't just walk away from something like this. Not when the stakes are this high." Jack's mind raced. He was out of time. This wasn't just about him and Dominic anymore. This was bigger than any of them. And whoever was pulling the strings, whoever had orchestrated all of this, wasn't going to stop until they had complete control. The woman in the shadows took another step forward, revealing more of her figure. Jack's eyes narrowed as he studied her. She wasn't someone he recognized, but there was something about her demeanor that made his instincts scream danger. She was dangerous. "Who are you?" Jack asked, his voice cold. The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You're about to find out," she replied, her voice smooth and calculated. Jack's mind raced as he tried to process everything that had happened. He had been lied to, manipulated, and used. Dominic had been a part of it from the start, and now this woman, this stranger, was playing a role in whatever game was unfolding. "I don't have time for games," Jack snapped, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Tell me who you're working for, or I'll make you." The woman's expression didn't change. She tilted her head slightly, as though she were considering his words, weighing her options. Then, without warning, she moved with blinding speed, darting toward the far end of the tunnel, vanishing into the shadows before Jack could react. "Damn it," Jack muttered, frustration building as he realized she was gone. But his focus snapped back to Dominic, who hadn't moved an inch. "You're not walking away from this," Jack said through gritted teeth. "You're going to tell me everything. And then, we're going to fix this. Together." Dominic's gaze was hard, his eyes cold and distant. "You still don't get it, Jack. There is no together anymore. I made my choice." The finality in Dominic's voice struck Jack like a physical blow. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a choice. And there was no going back from it. "Then we're done," Jack said, his voice low but resolute. "I don't need your help, and I sure as hell don't need anyone else's lies." The tension between them was palpable, thick with the weight of everything they had been through. But Jack knew, he knew deep down, that there was no more turning back. The mission had always been about uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. And now, more than ever, that truth was slipping further out of his reach. Dominic didn't respond. He simply turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Jack standing in the darkness of the tunnel. It was as if their partnership, their friendship, had never existed. Jack stood frozen for a moment, the silence deafening. Then, his mind snapped into action. He had to move. He had to find the answers. And he had to stop whatever this was before it was too late. The silence of the tunnel pressed down on Jack like a physical weight. Dominic's betrayal stung more than he cared to admit, but it wasn't the pain of it that kept him rooted in place. It was the overwhelming sense of urgency. The deeper truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And it was bigger than anything Jack could have ever imagined. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and moved toward the exit, determined to get to the bottom of this. The woman, the one who had slipped into the shadows, was his next lead. She was just a puzzle piece in a much larger scheme. But Jack knew she held answers he desperately needed. The cold air outside hit him as he stepped into the street, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The city was quieter than usual, as if the events of the past few days had thrown it into a temporary pause. The streets weren't empty, but everything felt off. People walked with their heads down, eyes avoiding contact, as if the fear of something unknown hung in the air. Jack didn't have time to dwell on the strange atmosphere. He needed to track the woman down. She couldn't have gone far. He had to find her before she vanished completely, taking whatever knowledge she had with her. He turned down an alley, his eyes searching every corner, every shadow. His pulse quickened as he recalled Dominic's words. "You never stood a chance." The words echoed in his mind like a warning bell. What did Dominic know that Jack didn't? What was the real game here? And who else was involved? A flicker of movement caught his eye. Jack froze, his senses sharpening. He turned just in time to see the woman disappear into a nearby building. Without hesitation, he followed, staying in the shadows, careful not to alert her. As he neared the building, he noticed something strange. There were no signs, no indication of what the place was. Just a heavy metal door that seemed out of place in the middle of a seemingly abandoned part of town. Jack's gut told him that this was it, that this was where the answers lay. He tested the door. Locked. He cursed under his breath but didn't back down. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. He scanned the area for any other way in and spotted a narrow window just above his head. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. Jack scaled the building quickly, his muscles burning with the effort. When he reached the window, he peered inside, careful not to make a sound. He could make out movement, shadows shifting on the other side. The woman. And she wasn't alone. His heart skipped a beat as the door behind him creaked open. Before he could react, a firm hand clamped around his wrist, pulling him back from the window. Jack spun around, his training kicking in, but the figure was already too close. "Easy there, Jack," a familiar voice said, low and dangerous. It was Dominic. Jack's blood ran cold. He had been so focused on the woman that he hadn't sensed the trap closing in on him. Dominic was here, and from the way he was gripping Jack's wrist, he wasn't going to let go easily. "Let me go, Dominic," Jack growled, his voice low but fierce. "You don't want to do this." Dominic's eyes glinted with something cold, something unrecognizable. "You think I haven't been preparing for this? You're out of your depth, Jack. You've been playing a game you don't understand." Jack twisted his wrist free, his eyes never leaving Dominic's face. The words stung, but they didn't matter anymore. Dominic was no longer the man Jack had trusted. He was just another obstacle to overcome. "I'm not the one who's out of my depth," Jack shot back, his fists clenched. "You're the one who's been lying to me. You're the one who sold out everything we stood for." Dominic's lip curled into a sneer, but there was no anger in his expression, just a strange, detached calmness. "You think I sold out?" "No, Jack. I'm just doing what needs to be done, what you still refuse to see." Jack took a step back, assessing his next move. He had to get past Dominic. There was no other choice. The woman inside that building was the key, and Jack wasn't going to let Dominic, or anyone, stop him now. "You're too far gone," Jack said, his voice quieter now, but with an edge of determination. "You've been played, Dominic, and I'm not going to let you drag me down with you." Dominic's expression flickered for a brief moment, something like uncertainty flashing in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He didn't speak again. Instead, he took a step toward Jack, his movements slow, deliberate. Jack didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, knocking Dominic back with a swift, calculated punch. The impact sent Dominic sprawling, but he was back on his feet in an instant, his eyes dark with fury. "Fine, Jack. If you want to do this the hard way," Dominic's voice trailed off, his expression hardening. "Then so be it." Before Jack could react, Dominic reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device. It looked like a tracker, a high-tech one that Jack didn't recognize. Dominic tossed it onto the ground between them, and a soft beep echoed through the air. The ground beneath their feet trembled. It was a warning. "You've just triggered something you don't understand," Dominic said, his voice now tinged with something more sinister. "You're playing with forces far beyond your control." Jack's blood ran cold. He had to act fast, but it was too late. The building behind him exploded in a violent burst of light and sound, throwing him off his feet. He heard the woman scream, her voice barely audible through the chaos. Jack's head slammed into the ground as everything around him blurred. His vision darkened, and the last thing he saw before everything went black was the cold, calculating look in Dominic's eyes. Pain was the first thing Jack felt when he regained consciousness. His head throbbed, his body aching from the force of the explosion. The world around him was a blur of smoke, dust, and shattered debris. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was alive or dreaming. But then the sharp sting of reality hit him, and he realized he was still in the fight. His eyes slowly opened, squinting against the haze in the air. The remnants of the building that had exploded were now nothing more than a pile of rubble. The woman, the one he'd been tracking, was gone. But something told him she hadn't just vanished. She was out there, somewhere, and she was waiting. Jack tried to push himself up, but his muscles screamed in protest. He groaned, forcing himself to roll onto his side and then slowly to his knees. The pain was almost unbearable, but he gritted his teeth and fought through it. He couldn't afford to stay down for long. As he staggered to his feet, his hand brushed against something cold and metallic on the ground. It was the tracker, Dominic's tracker. Jack picked it up, feeling its weight in his palm. It hadn't gone off yet, but the steady pulse of its signal reminded him that time was running out. The device's small screen flickered, and Jack stared at it, his mind racing. The tracker had a specific reading. It was leading him somewhere. Without another thought, Jack began moving toward the direction indicated by the tracker. He had no plan, no backup, and no idea what he was walking into. But the one thing he did know was that there was no turning back now. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered all around him, and if he wanted to make sense of this, he had to keep moving forward. The city was eerily quiet as Jack moved through the wreckage. The streets were deserted, the only sound the distant hum of emergency vehicles. There was a heaviness in the air, an unnatural stillness, the kind of silence that made Jack feel as though he was being watched. But every step he took brought him closer to the unknown, and he couldn't afford to hesitate now. Minutes later, he arrived at a small, unmarked warehouse at the edge of town. It was hidden in plain sight, tucked between two dilapidated buildings, as if no one wanted to draw attention to it. The tracker beeped softly, its signal stronger than ever. This was it. The place where everything would come together, or fall apart. Jack moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, but he knew that whatever was inside this building would be the key to stopping everything. Stopping Dominic, stopping the people behind this, and stopping whatever chaos had been unleashed. The door to the warehouse was slightly ajar. Jack could hear muffled voices coming from inside. He didn't hesitate. He pulled out his gun, checked the chamber, and silently pushed the door open. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the floor. A few crates were stacked in the corner, and the air smelled musty, as though the place had been abandoned for years. But there was something else, a sense of anticipation in the air, like the calm before a storm. As Jack moved deeper into the warehouse, he saw them. A group of men, armed and dangerous, standing around a large table, their attention focused on a set of blueprints. The woman from the explosion was there too, her face finally visible in the light. But it wasn't the recognition of her face that stopped Jack in his tracks. It was the figure standing at the head of the table. Elon Musk. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had seen Musk on TV, heard about his ventures and innovations, but he never expected to find him here, in the middle of this chaos. The man was a genius, a visionary, but what was he doing here, in this hidden warehouse, surrounded by weapons and secrecy? Musk didn't look surprised to see Jack. In fact, he barely looked up from the blueprints as Jack stepped closer. His eyes were cold, calculating, as if he'd been expecting this moment for a long time. You should have stayed away, Jack, Musk said, his voice low but filled with authority. You're too deep now, and you're not going to walk out of here with the answers you're looking for. Jack's pulse quickened. Musk's calm demeanor only made the situation more unnerving. Jack had expected resistance, but this was different. This was a man who knew exactly how the game worked and was willing to play it on his own terms. I don't know who you think you are, Jack spat, his anger rising, but I'm not backing down now. This ends today. Musk finally looked up, his eyes locking onto Jack's with a calculating gaze. You don't understand, he said, his voice almost a whisper. I'm not the one who's been manipulating you. I'm not your enemy. Jack's head spun with confusion. Then who the hell is? Musk took a slow breath and leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Jack's. You're chasing shadows, Jack. The real enemy is much closer than you think. The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. The realization crashed over him in waves. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had been fighting for, had been a lie. Musk wasn't the enemy. He was just another piece in the puzzle, a piece Jack still didn't fully understand. Musk's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, his expression now deadly serious. You're going to have to make a choice, Jack. A choice between following the truth or walking away before it consumes you. The tension in the room was thick, like the calm before a storm. Jack could feel the weight of Musk's words hanging over him, like an impending catastrophe. I'm not afraid of the truth, Jack said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. But if you're not my enemy, then who is? Musk smiled grimly. The one who's been pulling the strings all along. The one you've been too blind to see. Before Jack could respond, the room erupted into chaos. The men around the table stood up, drawing weapons. Jack's heart raced as he realized that the true battle was only just beginning. The sound of weapons being drawn filled the room, sharp and menacing. Jack's mind raced, but his body moved instinctively, ducking behind a stack of crates just as the first shots rang out. The deafening gunfire echoed through the warehouse, and Jack could feel the heat of the bullets flying past him, narrowly missing their target. He wasn't sure what Musk's game was, but one thing was clear. The man was not on Jack's side, and neither were the armed men in the room. This wasn't just a simple confrontation anymore. It was a fight for survival. The chaos seemed to slow in Jack's mind as he took in the scene. He had only moments to think, and he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Musk's voice cut through the gunfire, calm and measured as always, but it carried an edge of finality. Get him, Musk shouted, pointing in Jack's direction. Jack's heart pounded, but he stayed focused. He had no time for hesitation. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but he had to survive. He darted out from behind cover, quickly returning fire. The men scattered, seeking their own cover, and Jack moved fast, too fast for them to track. As he sprinted across the room, his thoughts were consumed with the realization that the moment had come. The truth Musk had hinted at was something much bigger than Jack had ever imagined. Whoever was behind all of this had orchestrated every move, from the hijackings to the explosion, and now, they were in control. But Jack wasn't going down without a fight. Not now. Not ever. The warehouse felt like a war zone as Jack took cover behind a large crate, crouching low and scanning the room. His eyes locked onto Musk, still standing at the head of the table, giving orders to his men. The calm expression on his face made Jack's blood boil. How could Musk remain so calm in the middle of all this chaos? Jack's finger tightened around the trigger as he spotted an opening. The man closest to Musk was caught in a moment of vulnerability, momentarily distracted by the ongoing firefight. Jack didn't waste a second. He fired. The man dropped to the ground with a thud, but Musk didn't even flinch. Instead, he calmly adjusted his glasses, as if he were watching a mere inconvenience play out. That's when it hit Jack. Musk wasn't afraid. He wasn't worried. Musk had planned for this. Jack, you don't know who you're dealing with, Musk called out, his voice a calm contrast to the chaos around them. This isn't just about you. It's never been about you. Jack's mind raced as he moved to a new position, always staying one step ahead of the men hunting him down. Musk's words lingered in the air like a dark cloud, but Jack refused to let them distract him. He had a job to do. Musk's voice echoed again, colder now. You think you can stop this? You think you can walk away with your hands clean after all you've seen? It's too late for you, Jack. You're already in too deep. The realization hit Jack like a bolt of lightning. Musk wasn't just involved. He was the mastermind. The game had always been rigged, and Jack had been playing by someone else's rules. But now, it was time to flip the script. With a newfound sense of purpose, Jack bolted toward Musk, his gun raised and ready. He wasn't going to let this go any longer. But as he closed the gap, a cold, mechanical voice cut through the air. Stop. The word was crisp, clear, and full of authority. Jack froze, his finger hovering over the trigger. Musk's calm gaze locked with Jack's as a door at the far end of the warehouse opened, and two figures stepped inside. They were both dressed in black tactical gear, their faces hidden behind masks. The aura of danger they brought with them was palpable. Jack's instincts told him these weren't just ordinary soldiers. They were something more. Who are they? Jack demanded, his voice hoarse. Musk didn't answer. Instead, he smiled, almost pityingly. You still don't get it, do you? These men? They're not your enemies. They're the ones who will decide whether you live or die. The two figures advanced slowly, their movements precise. Jack's pulse quickened as he took a defensive stance, ready for whatever came next. The room was closing in on him, the walls of his world narrowing as these new players entered the game. Musk stepped back, watching from a safe distance as his operatives closed in on Jack. I didn't want it to come to this, Jack, Musk said softly, almost as if he were speaking to an old friend. But you've left me no choice. Jack's eyes darted between the two figures, trying to read their movements, their intentions. He couldn't afford to make another mistake. If he failed now, it was over. The silence was suffocating as the two men reached him, their guns raised. Jack's breath hitched in his chest. He had only one shot at this, one chance to turn the tide in his favor. In one swift movement, Jack lunged forward, using the element of surprise. He knocked the first man off balance, sending him crashing to the floor. The second man reacted instantly, aiming his weapon, but Jack was quicker. He twisted the man's arm, disarming him in a fluid motion, and then turned the gun on Musk's remaining guards. In the chaos that followed, Jack found himself face to face with Musk once again. The man didn't flinch as Jack raised the gun, his expression as cold as ever. You're out of your depth, Jack, Musk said, his voice steady. You think you can just walk away from this? Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his finger ready to pull the trigger. This was the moment he had been fighting for, the chance to end this, to take down Musk and everything he represented. But something in Musk's eyes gave Jack pause. There was a glimmer of something Jack couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear. It was something far more dangerous. Don't, Musk warned, his voice lowering. You have no idea what you're about to unleash. The gun trembled in Jack's hand, his mind in turmoil. Musk's warning echoed in his ears, reverberating through the chaos of the warehouse. Every instinct screamed at him to pull the trigger, to end it all, to take Musk down and finally bring closure to this nightmare. But something in Musk's voice, something in his cold, calculating gaze, stopped Jack. Don't you see, Jack? Musk said slowly, almost as if savoring the moment. You're a pawn in a much bigger game. This isn't just about you, or me, or the people you've lost. This is about the future. Jack's eyes narrowed as he fought to steady his breathing. He had heard the rumors, the whispers about Musk's secret projects, his relentless drive for control. But he hadn't fully understood the magnitude of what Musk was involved in. Until now, Musk stepped forward, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. You can kill me, but the truth is, it won't change anything. There are forces at play here that you can't even comprehend. The world is changing, Jack. You've been living in the past. Jack's grip tightened around the gun. What do you mean? Musk smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible twitch of satisfaction at the corner of his mouth. I've been preparing for this moment for a long time. You think this, he gestured to the carnage around them, is the end? No, it's only the beginning. For the first time, Musk seemed to lower his guard, and Jack saw something flicker in his eyes. It wasn't just arrogance or manipulation. It was conviction. Musk truly believed he was the architect of something far bigger than anyone could grasp. I've developed technologies, systems, plans, Musk continued, his voice taking on a measured, almost prophetic tone. Things that no one, not even the governments of the world, will be able to stop. The helicopter crash you nearly died in? That was just the first test. I've been creating the infrastructure to control events like that. I have access to far more than you could ever imagine. Jack's mind raced as he processed Musk's words. Was it possible? Could all of this, every tragedy, every confrontation, have been orchestrated from the shadows? His mind couldn't keep up with the scope of it. But one thing was clear. Musk was too dangerous to be allowed to continue. I won't let you get away with this, Jack said, his voice low but firm. He was ready. He had to be. Musk didn't react the way Jack expected. Instead of a smug laugh or an attempt to disarm him, Musk simply nodded, as if he had already anticipated Jack's response. You don't understand, Musk repeated, but this time, his voice was tinged with something that sounded almost like regret. You don't know how much I've sacrificed to get here. The risks, the decisions I've made, they were necessary for what's coming. And you, he paused and looked Jack dead in the eye. You were part of the plan all along. Jack's heart skipped a beat. What? You were never meant to stop me, Jack. You were always meant to help me, Musk said, his words hanging in the air like a bombshell. I knew you'd come after me. I knew you'd try to take me down. That's why I made sure you were part of the mission from the very beginning. Jack stood frozen, unable to process the gravity of what Musk was saying. All his actions, everything he had done, had been part of Musk's grand scheme. Every twist, every betrayal, every challenge he had faced had been calculated. You used me? Jack whispered, his voice raw with disbelief. Musk nodded. You had the skills, the courage. You were the perfect pawn in my game. But now, Jack, you can join me. You can be part of the future I'm building. Help me, and we can shape the world together. The offer hung in the air between them like a dangerous temptation. Jack's mind spun, torn between his desire to end Musk's reign of manipulation and the eerie truth that Musk had somehow seen this coming. Had Jack been destined to walk this path all along? For a moment, Jack thought of his friends, the lives lost, the countless people who had suffered because of Musk's actions. The anger surged within him, but so did something else, a flicker of doubt. Was he the hero here? Or had he simply been playing into Musk's hands all this time? As the weight of the decision pressed on his chest, Jack finally spoke, his voice steady. No, I won't be a part of your twisted plan, Musk. With that, he raised the gun. Before Musk could react, a sudden noise, louder than any gunshot, more intense than any explosion, shook the entire warehouse. The walls trembled, the ground beneath them cracked. For a moment, everything went silent. Jack's eyes darted around, trying to locate the source of the disturbance. Then, he saw it. Flashes of light, cracks in the walls, and the unmistakable hum of machinery coming to life. Musk's eyes widened, his confident demeanor cracking for the first time. No, this wasn't supposed to happen. But it was too late. The systems Musk had put in place, the very ones that had kept him in control for so long, were now turning against him. Jack knew in that moment. This was the end of the line for Elon Musk. His empire of secrets, his complex web of control. It was all collapsing. And Jack had a front-row seat. The warehouse was engulfed in chaos, as security systems malfunctioned and alarms blared. The very infrastructure Musk had relied on to secure his future had now become his undoing. In the distance, the first signs of law enforcement could be seen, storming the building to put an end to Musk's reign of terror. Jack stood still, his gun lowered, watching as everything Musk had built began to crumble. And just like that, it was over. The authorities took Musk into custody, his empire dismantled. Jack never fully understood the depths of what had happened, nor did he care to. He had done what he had set out to do. Stop a man who believed himself above the law, above everything. But in the end, it wasn't just Jack who had brought him down. It was the very system Musk had put in place, working against him in the final moments. As Jack walked away from the wreckage, the dust settling around him, He felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. The world would go on. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope for it after all. The city skyline stretched out before Jack, the evening sun casting long shadows across the streets below. The chaos that had erupted in the warehouse seemed like a distant memory now. Musk's capture had sent ripples through every corner of the world, and the networks were flooded with reports of the criminal empire that had finally crumbled. But Jack wasn't interested in the headlines. He wasn't interested in the victory. He was more focused on the aftermath. He stood on the balcony of his small apartment, staring out into the horizon. His thoughts were scattered, like pieces of a puzzle that hadn't yet been put together. The past few weeks had felt like an endless storm, but now it seemed to have passed. And yet, the weight of everything still lingered. He glanced at the photograph on the table beside him. It was a picture of his team, his friends, the ones who had fought beside him, who had sacrificed so much. He had lost more than he could bear. And the ones who had made it through, well, they would never be the same again. But they had survived. That was something. As he sipped his coffee, the sound of his phone buzzing broke through the quiet. He glanced down at the screen. An unknown number. Hesitant, he answered. Jack? The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, yet the tone was calm and direct. It's Carla. We need to talk. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Carla, his closest ally, the one person who had stood by him through every twist and turn, through every plan and betrayal. She had been the one to push him forward when he thought he couldn't take another step. Now, after everything had calmed down, she was calling him. He knew this conversation was coming. I'm listening, Jack said, his voice steady. There was a pause before Carla spoke again, her words measured. We've been looking into Musk's operation. There are things we missed, things that weren't fully exposed. The system he built, the networks he set up, they're still active. Jack's grip on his phone tightened. What do you mean? I'm saying that the empire might be gone, but the foundations remain. People who were loyal to him, they're still out there. And they're already making moves. We don't know how deep it goes, Jack, but it's not over. Not yet. Jack's mind raced. It had seemed like the end, but now, a cold realization settled in his gut. Musk had been more than just a man. He was a symbol, a force that had built something massive, something far-reaching. And it wasn't something that could be wiped away so easily. We can't just let it go, Jack. There's a lot more at stake here. Jack exhaled slowly. He had wanted a break, a moment of peace. But peace, it seemed, was elusive. The world didn't stop, and the problems didn't end. And as much as he wanted to walk away, to live a quiet life, he knew Carla was right. They had unfinished business. I'm in, Jack replied finally, his voice resolute. Where do we start? Carla's voice softened, but there was still a sharp edge to it. We go after the remnants of Musk's operation. It's bigger than we thought. And this time, we need to do it right. Jack took another sip of his coffee, the weight of the decision settling over him. He had been through hell to bring Musk down, but the battle wasn't over. It couldn't be. All right, he said, his voice firm. Let's finish this. As the call ended, Jack stepped away from the window, the final rays of sunlight fading into the night. There was still so much to do, so many loose ends to tie up. But now, he wasn't alone. He had Carla. He had his team. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a spark of hope. The world was still dangerous. There were still threats lurking in the shadows. But Jack wasn't afraid. He had been tested, and he had survived. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. And this time, he wasn't just fighting for revenge. He was fighting for something bigger, a future that was free from the shadows of those like Musk. As he walked out the door, he felt something new inside him. It wasn't just the adrenaline of the past few weeks. It was determination. The kind of determination that comes when you know the fight is far from over, but you're ready to face whatever comes next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?